732 Going back in time, spacetime Mark 2. 732 Going back in time, spacetime Mark 2. In the endless chaos sea, Kui Heng clapped his hands gently and felt the subtle changes in the past timeline. He could not help but sigh in his heart. After reaching the peak of the mid-stage return to Void Realm, there's no need to make any changes to the past. It's more hidden and difficult to detect. As he directly attacked using his past self and did not cross the river of time to attack the past, the river of time did not show any clear fluctuations. Even a perfected heavenless realm immortal emperor would not be able to discover such a change in the timeline. This was because no matter how powerful an immortal emperor was, they were still entangled in the river of time. After enduring a huge amount of the corrosion of time, it was impossible to differentiate such subtle time fluctuations. Only cultivators who had reached the mid-stage return to Void Realm could easily sense the abnormality of the past. Experts at the immortal ancestor level should also be able to sense it. They had benefited from the power of the divine gift of the supreme god of man and also had characteristics that transcended the river of time. Although the Gate Master Immortal Emperor was nurtured by the immortal ancestors with Kui Heng's dharmic powers, and he did not have to withstand the scouring of time, his strength was not great enough, and the divine gift he received was very small. He was also unable to sense it. At my current realm, even if I've modified the events of the past, as long as an immortal ancestor doesn't interfere, I won't be discovered. Kui Heng thought to himself, unfortunately, this influence is only limited to the timeline I once existed in. I can't use this method to modify the time periods that I haven't existed yet. From the moment I walked out of the beginner's space until now, it has only been a few thousand years. It hasn't even been 10,000 years. My existence has only occupied such a short period of time. Compared to the long river of time, it's too short. If the immortal ancestors make some arrangements in the timeline of my existence, I won't have any room to resist. I have to break through to the late-stage return to Void Realm as soon as possible and continue to spread my existence to the upper reaches of the river of time. Only by occupying those timelines that originally didn't exist for me and extending the range of my existence on the time spectrum as much as possible can I be safer. Previously, he had seen the power of the immortal ancestors through the Gate Master Immortal Emperor. This made him feel a huge sense of danger. Although the immortal ancestors were all presiding over the meeting in the ninth heaven and would not appear in the world for 1,000 years, no one could guarantee that they would not suddenly end this meeting. He could not place his safety on the decisions of others. He had to increase his cultivation as soon as possible. Fortunately, the flow of time was no longer very meaningful to the current Kui Heng. As long as the immortal ancestor did not appear suddenly, he still had lots of time to explore the path to break through to the late-stage return to Void Realm. Exploring the cultivation path was not a simple matter. Although there were many universes in the Chaos Sea, most of them were filled with ordinary humans. As long as it was a human society and had the form of civilization, there would not be any fundamental changes. Although the situation they displayed was strange and different, the core was still the common values of the human race. After Kui Heng investigated tens of billions of universes dominated by human civilization, he still did not gain anything. In the end, he found inspiration in a universe with special and strange life forms. In an extremely dense universe without any civilization, he discovered a strange life form. This life form appeared to be in a strange liquid state. It did not have intelligence and only had the instinct to continuously expand. And the way it expanded gave Kui Heng inspiration. This life form could not move on its own and could only stay where it was born. Therefore, when expanding its body, it would first let a portion of its body separate from itself before projecting it into the vast universe. When this portion of the split body landed on a planet, it began to absorb the energy of the planet to grow. When this portion of his body grew to a certain extent, its main body could complete the expansion through the connection with it. After completing the expansion, the clone could transform into the main body at any time. This way, it was basically equivalent to the main body covering the location of the clone. As the number of clones of this living being increased, the range that its main body could cover would also increase. If one day, the soul of this life form spreads throughout the entire universe, Then it could appear in any corner of the universe at any time, covering the entire universe. Such a life form gave Kui Heng an inspiration. Since I can't directly cover the time period where I don't exist yet, can I first leave a clear mark at that time point and use this mark as a Dao mark to rewind my existence to that time period? If this was feasible, as long as I established enough Dao markings in the past timeline, I could use this as a foundation to occupy those timelines that I did not exist in yet. In that case, I would need to establish a precise identity in the past timeline. After all, if I want to form a Dao mark that can occupy the past timeline, I definitely have to form a true identity. Thinking of this, Kui Heng was suddenly stunned. He thought to himself, this seems to have the same effect as the process of refining fake into real when I was at the soul formation realm. It's just that the scale has changed to include space and time. Could this really be the cultivation method of the late-stage return to void realm? Is the soul formation realm preparation for this step? In that case, can I refer to the method of forming a fake self? The process of reaching the peak soul formation realm from the late-stage soul formation realm was to constantly form more fake selves and finally fuse them with himself. During this process, Kui Heng formed a lot of real and fake selves by taking on a fake identity. He was quite experienced in forming a fake identity. The method to leave behind clear traces of my identity in the past timeline can be based on the process of forming a fake self. However, this involves the time dimension after all. There are far more things to pay attention to than the spatial dimension. If I cause too much trouble in the past timeline, it's very likely to cause a series of chain reactions, causing the changes in the current timeline. I'll try using a smaller identity first. Although I can't occupy the time periods where I don't exist yet, it won't be a problem for me to make some modifications to those time periods or descend over. Kui Heng quickly made a decision in his heart and thought to himself, next, it's time to determine which time period to go back to. At this moment, his eyes began to flicker with the lights and shadows of the past. Images flashed before his eyes, as if time was flowing backward. Primordial world, chaos sea, immeasurable universe. Central immortal land of the silver disk star sea, Great Yang Holy Land, Heaven Realm. Taihong Star, Purple Sun Realm, Five Views Realm. Daoju Star. 733,400 years before leaving the beginner's space. 733,400 years before leaving the beginner's space. The waves of the river of time flowed past Kui Heng, but the power of time could no longer bring him decay. As the shadows retreated rapidly, Kui Heng's perception spread from the current spacetime to Daoju Star in the past. In the end, it stopped at the moment he walked out of the beginner's space, 400 years ago. Kui Heng had considered why he chose this time period. His 300 years in the beginner's space were completely blank, as if they did not exist at all. However, this did not mean that he was completely unable to touch those 300 years. In fact, Kui Heng had always been able to affect the 300 years period of time and could directly descend over. However, he could only appear outside the beginner's space and could not trace the situation in the beginner's space at all. This might cause a very strange outcome. If he had established a spatial Dao mark in those 300 years and completed the unification of the timeline, then what was going on with his body in the beginner's space? Therefore, before he figured out this problem, he did not intend to touch the 300-year timeline. To be on the safe side, Kui Heng further reversed the time period of 300 years, which was 400 years before he walked out of the beginner's space. Now was the period in the history of Daoju Star when the four countries fought for supremacy. The Great Yuan dynasty that had been overthrown by Hong Fuguei had yet to be established. It was divided into 32 states by Great Xia, Great Chen, Great Yang, and Great Zhao. Great Xia and Great Yang were in the north and had many archers and cavalry. Their battle strength was incomparably ferocious, but they lived in a bitter and cold place. They were lacking in resources and rations, so they could not fight long-term. Great Chen and Great Zhao were in the south. There was fertile land with incomparably abundant resources. There was also prosperous trade and handicrafts. The standard of living of the people was completely incomparable to the north. However, horses were scarce, and the soldiers' combat motivation was far inferior to the north. Their overall combat strength was relatively weak. The four countries had conflicts with each other and often attacked each other. However, at times, they would form alliances and benefit each other. Just like that, they were in a deadlock for hundreds of years. The people of this era all thought that one of the four countries would eventually conquer the others and unify the world. Once again, the entire 32 states would obtain the final fruit of victory. However, no one expected a group of barbarians to attack from the four northern states that had been ignored by the four countries. Moreover, these barbarians used less than 10 years to sweep through the four countries, destroying normal civilization and order, establishing a great Yuan dynasty ruled by barbarians. Kui Heng had descended to the Great Zhao. It was the richest country among the four countries, but it was also the weakest country. It was said that when the barbarians invaded, it was the current emperor who took the lead to offer up the city and surrender. However, in the end, the emperor did not end up well and was torn apart by the barbarians. At this moment, Kui Heng was standing outside the capital of the Great Zhao. Looking at the city gate in front of him and seeing the ragged and thin commoners walking on a path with nobles dressed in silk and satin, he could not help but sigh in his heart. Linjing City was known as the richest and most prosperous place in the world. It was a paradise in the hearts of the people of the north, a dream city. This was indeed the truth. However, what contributed to this prosperity was the suffering and even death of countless ordinary people. The Great Zhao began in a city in the capital. The dignitaries in Linjing City seemed to be living in heaven, but the people in Linjing City were all living in the soil. The land outside Linjing City was filled with starved people, and the people were in dire straits. It was like hell. What a good place. Kui Heng sneered, then turned around and left. Such a dynasty deserved to be destroyed. It was inevitable in history. He did not intend to interfere, nor could he. Great Xia, Great Chen, Great Yang, and Great Zhao were all wiped out by the barbarians. No matter which period of time he touched, it could trigger future changes and cause a series of problems. To Kui Heng, the biggest problem when he returned to the past was, how could he leave an identity that could be remembered by the world in this era without affecting established history and form a spatial Dao mark that could be traced back? This was not an easy task. Fortunately, I've already occupied the timeline 400 years later. I can monitor that timeline in all aspects. No matter what happens, I can modify it at any time. This way, I'll have a chance to test an error. Even if the established history has deviated because of what I did in this spacetime, I can still correct it by modifying the past. Kui Heng thought to himself, however, I didn't occupy the current time period. I can only cross the river of time and attack the past. This method isn't very secretive. If I modify it too often, it will be too eye-catching and it will be easy for experts to notice this time period. That won't be good. I still have to try carefully and reduce the number of times I modify it. The most stable way is to choose a suitable person at the time 400 years later and rewind his past to find his ancestor in this era. It's best if this person stayed by my side 400 years ago. This way, his family's development in the past 400 years will be very clear. I can also control his future experiences very well. At the same time, in the Zhuhe County office 400 years later, Kui Heng, who was handling official business, suddenly looked up at Hui Shi, who was standing at the side. At this time, Old Master Huang of Zhuhe County had just been arrested and was about to gather the people with authority for a public trial. 734,400 years before leaving the beginner's space, 2. 734,400 years before leaving the beginner's space, 2. Just yesterday, Kui Heng obtained a martial technique manual from the Lotus Flower Monastery, the Buddha's Fury Heart Palm. He tried to use his dharmic powers to execute this martial technique. Hui Shi saw with his own eyes that this martial technique displayed unbelievable power in Kui Heng's hands. It actually ignited a flame that was like the sun, making him feel that the world was about to be burned to ashes by this flame and everything was about to be destroyed. This made Hui Shi wonder if the county lord he traced back to was still a human. He was probably an immortal who had descended from the sky. Therefore, now that Kui Heng suddenly looked up at him, he felt very nervous and worried. Could it be that this immortal did not want a mortal like him to follow him? Hui Shi, who's your ancestor? Kui Heng asked with a smile. At the same time, he began to look into Hui Shi's past. After going back to the time when he was born, he went back to his father's past at this time and so on, going back to 400 years ago. The reason why he spoke to Hui Shi was to make the past correspond to the current conversation. It could make the process of backtracking more smooth and effective. Hui Shi was clearly stunned when he heard this. He was very surprised. He did not expect Kui Heng to ask this at all, but he still replied, Immortal Venerable, my surname is Chen. My father was originally a general of the Great Jin and had fought on the battlefield for many years. Unfortunately, he was harmed by a traitor later on. My grandfather was also a general in the army, and my grandfather was also in the army. My Chen family has basically been in the army since the end of the Yuan dynasty. Only I became a monk. What about before the end of the Yuan dynasty? Kui Heng continued to ask. Actually, at this moment, he had already returned to 400 years ago. Great Yuan was a place where barbarians lived in seclusion in the Central Plains, so our Chen family lived in seclusion. Hui Shi could also tell that Kui Heng clearly wanted to ask about his past, so he continued, Before we came to the Great Yuan, our Chen family was considered a scholarly family. We lived in Zhao country and farmed and studied. Our ancestors were once prime ministers. Later on, many of them became officials in the imperial court. However, at the end of the Great Zhao dynasty, the imperial court was muddle-headed and the people were struggling to survive. My ancestor was plotted against by a bandit and was stripped of his position and became a commoner. He was exiled from the capital. Hui Shi recounted the history of his family. He knew these things very well. Kui Heng was also comparing it with his past history and realized that the compatibility was extremely high. There were only a few blurry times and places that did not match. The overall authenticity was extremely high. This was very rare. After figuring out the Chen family's history in the past 400 years, Kui Heng confirmed the candidates he was going to look for next. Hui Shi's ancestor, Chen Tangwen, was the Minister of War of the Great Zhao. He was also a profound Gate Realm Grandmaster and one of the top figures in the world. However, because Minister Chen insisted on the policy of attacking the north, he repeatedly submitted reports and offended too many people. He had already been eliminated from the imperial court. In order to overthrow Minister Chen, the Minister of Revenue, Official Personnel, and Rights jointly submitted a report. The Privy Minister tacitly agreed, and the censorate even fabricated a series of crimes to impeach him. In the end, Minister Chen was stripped of his position and exiled to Xiong County in the southern border. It was a total of 3,000 miles from Linjing to Xiong County in the southern border. Along the way, there were all kinds of dense forests, swamps, and miasma. If one was not careful, they would die. In history, Minister Chen also obtained some opportunities on the way to exile, but in the end, he still died of depression. Kui Heng planned to take him away and teach him some martial techniques as an otherworldly expert so that he could live in seclusion in the future. This could minimize his influence on the outside world. Moreover, Chen Tangwen already had an heir before he was exiled. There was no need to worry about this affecting Hui Shi 400 years later. As for how to make his identity be remembered by the world through Chen Tangwen, Kui Heng already had a plan. On a remote mountain road, Chen Tangwen, who was dressed in ragged clothes, walked with difficulty. As a former Qi transformation grandmaster, even if his martial cultivation was crippled, his body's foundation was still intact. He should not have tired himself so easily. However, along the way, the two constables who escorted him deducted his food rations. They only let him eat 1 bowl of porridge a day. They also walked on mountain roads and his limbs were shackled. Even men of iron would find it difficult to support themselves. The two constables had dark faces and ordinary appearances. Their eyebrows were slender and they looked a little treacherous. One of the constables was called Wang San. Seeing that Chen Tangwen was having a hard time walking, he stepped forward and kicked him. He mocked, "Minister Chen, aren't you a Qi transformation grandmaster? You're walking too slowly." Plop. Chen Tangwen fell to the ground, and his hands were cut by the stones. After staying in a weak state for a long time to rush along the mountain path, his physical condition was already extremely poor. Now that he was suddenly kicked down, his face immediately turned pale and his entire body trembled in pain. However, Chen Tangwen still gritted his teeth and did not make a sound. He moved his body, wanting to stand up again. Boom! The other constable came over and kicked him again, causing Chen Tangwen, who had just arched his back, to lie on the ground again, unable to stand up. This constable's name was Li Er. He looked at Chen Tangwen, who was lying on the ground, with a carefree expression and said with a smile, "Haha, the former Grand Minister of War has also fallen at our feet. Satisfying, satisfying. Ha ha ha." The Minister of War was in charge of military affairs and was also known as the Grand Minister of War. Wang San came over and squatted down. He smiled at Chen Tangwen and said, "Minister Chen, how about this? Kowtow to us brothers and we'll let you have a full meal." Li Er also smiled and said, "It's best if you can call me Grandpa." In their opinion, exile to the southern wilderness was a sure death outcome. Moreover, Minister Chen had been impeached by many ministers and was even disliked by the current Prime Minister. There was definitely no possibility of him making a comeback. Naturally, they could humiliate him as they pleased. Chen Tangwen did not reply. He only glanced coldly at the two constables and forced himself to stand up slowly again. Then, he walked forward with difficulty. Wang San and Li Er were a little terrified by Chen Tangwen's gaze just now. They stood rooted to the ground for a long time before coming back to their senses. Li Er felt that he had lost face and could not help but curse, "Damn it, you old thing. You're courting death." As he cursed, he wanted to rush over and kick Chen Tangwen again. "Forget it." Wang San raised his hand to stop Li Er. He lowered his voice and shook his head. After all, this old thing was once a grandmaster and had unlocked his profound gate. Even if his martial cultivation is crippled, he might still have some hidden ability. It's fine if we play with him, but don't anger him too much lest he becomes desperate. Li Er waved his hand unhappily, but in the end, he nodded and said, "All right, I'll let him off." "All right." Wang San nodded and looked up at the sky. "Let's go quickly. It's getting late. It looks like it's going to rain again. I just saw a dilapidated temple in front. Let's spend the night there." "All right, we should indeed leave quickly." Li Er glanced at Chen Tangwen, who was staggering forward. He strode forward and shouted, "Minister Chen, you're too slow. It's almost dark. Let's walk faster." As he spoke, he grabbed Chen Tangwen's shackles and walked forward quickly. Immediately, Chen Tangwen's footsteps became even more unstable. However, Chen Tangwen still managed to stabilize himself and followed behind with difficulty. When night fell, Chen Tangwen was escorted to the dilapidated temple by Li Er and Wang San. Li Er was the first to enter. His eyes narrowed as he greeted, "Haha, hello, everyone. I didn't expect this road to be so lively." At this moment, there were already 4 people in this dilapidated temple. It looked like there were 3 groups. One of them was an old man with a young girl. They looked like a father and daughter pair. The other 2 were a middle-aged monk and a young Daoist priest in feathered clothes. From their attire and temperament, they should be martial artists. Li Er shouted loudly. Actually, he was also reporting to Wang San behind him. Wang San, who was following behind, immediately became vigilant. He held the baton and was ready to attack at any time. Chen Tangwen kept his head lowered and said nothing. Wang San walked over and actually cupped his hands politely. "Everyone, we're guards escorting prisoners and happened to pass by. It's already late and we plan to stay here for the night. Is it inconvenient?" The old man was the first to shake his head and say, "When my daughter and I came here, that master and that little Daoist were already here. The little Daoist should have arrived first." The young Daoist priest was actually Kui Heng. He nodded slightly and smiled. "When traveling outside, everyone is just looking for convenience. I was just 1 step ahead of everyone. You can stay." At this moment, the middle-aged monk who was meditating with his eyes closed suddenly opened his eyes and said indifferently, "This poor monk advises you to leave this place immediately. Otherwise, You might suffer a fatal disaster. 735 Leaving a Dao mark in the past. 735 Leaving a Dao mark in the past. A fatal disaster? Kui Heng turned to look at the middle-aged monk and chuckled. How should I address you, master? Actually, he had long understood everything through rewinding time. This middle-aged monk's name was Jueshin. He was originally a sweeper monk from the Lotus Flower Monastery. 30 years ago, when Jueshin was cleaning the scripture depository, he accidentally discovered a martial arts manual sandwiched between the Buddhist scriptures. It was called the Jade Bone Indestructible Technique. At that time, Jueshin was only 13 years old and was in a servant courtyard that did not allow the cultivation of martial arts. However, he had always yearned for martial arts. Hence, he secretly practiced this martial technique. Moreover, in order to prevent his martial cultivation from being discovered, he even secretly burned the secret manual that recorded the Jade Bone Indestructible Technique. For the next 30 years, everything was peaceful. Jueshin also secretly cultivated the 9 levels of the Jade Bone Indestructible Technique to the 6th level and possessed the cultivation of the Qi transformation realm. Such a realm could be called a grandmaster in the pugilistic world, but in the eyes of the world, Jueshin was just an ordinary old sweeping monk. Until one day, the famous bandit Huang Tang sneaked into the Lotus Flower Monastery scripture depository to steal books and was discovered by Jueshin, who was cleaning. In a moment of desperation, he used his martial technique and shattered Huang Tang's heart meridian with a single palm strike, killing him on the spot, saving the scriptures from being stolen. However, this also exposed his martial cultivation. An old sweeper monk was actually a Qi transformation grandmaster. This unbelievable matter immediately attracted the attention of the senior monks of Lotus Flower Monastery. After rewarding Jueshin, they began to ask about the source of Jueshin's martial cultivation. Jueshin had grown up in the Lotus Flower Monastery from a very young age. Most of his time was spent in the miscellaneous court. He rarely interacted with others and was not good with words. Soon, he could not withstand the interrogation of the eminent monks and told the truth. After learning the truth, the senior monks of Lotus Flower Monastery did not blame Jueshin for violating the rules of the temple and practicing martial arts. Instead, they rewarded him again and even promoted him to the position of deputy head of the Dharma court. They hoped that he would write down the Jade Bone Indestructible Technique. According to the senior monk, the Jade Bone Indestructible Technique was one of the ultimate techniques of the Lotus Flower Monastery. It was a divine technique that could allow one to reach the peak of the world. It was very important to the Lotus Flower Monastery. If he could let the Jade Bone Indestructible Technique return to the Lotus Flower Monastery, Jueshin would have boundless merit and would be protected by Buddha for the rest of his life. Jueshin did not doubt him and wrote down the Jade Bone Indestructible Technique in detail. During this process, he further deepened his understanding of this martial technique and quietly broke through to the 7th level, opening the profound gate between his brows and reaching the profound gate realm. After the Lotus Flower Monastery obtained the Jade Bone Indestructible Technique, they increased Jueshin's treatment and made him the head of the Dharma court. However, at the usual meeting of the court heads, the abbot of the Lotus Flower Monastery and the other court heads actually attacked at the same time, wanting to kill Jueshin. Fortunately, they did not know that Jueshin had already broken through to the profound gate realm and he successfully escaped from the Lotus Flower Monastery. From then on, Jueshin became a traitor of the Lotus Flower Monastery. The Lotus Flower Monastery pinned the crimes of theft of martial arts, lust for women, deceiving his master and desecration of his ancestors on Jueshin. At the same time, he had a new identity. Remnant Evil Immortal Wind Monk. From then on, Jueshin roamed the martial world, fleeing for his life. It was only then that he knew. It turned out that the Jade Bone Indestructible Technique was not a martial technique of the Lotus Flower Monastery at all. Instead, it was the ultimate technique of the Daoist sect, Immortal Wind Monastery, that had been destroyed by the Lotus Flower Monastery 100 years ago. It was also the general outline of many martial techniques. Many of the Lotus Flower Monastery's 81 ultimate techniques were based on the martial techniques of the Immortal Wind Monastery. However, because they lacked this general outline, it was difficult for them to unleash their full power. With this jade bone indestructible technique, the martial arts inheritance of the Lotus Flower Monastery would rise to another level. Jushin finally understood that the Lotus Flower Monastery had never believed his explanation. They probably treated him as a remnant of the Immortal Wind Monastery from the beginning, which was why they wanted to kill him after obtaining the martial technique. Even if their suspicions were wrong, the Lotus Flower Monastery would not lose anything. It was already the 5th year since Jushin fled the martial world. His martial cultivation had also advanced by leaps and bounds, reaching the Xiantian realm and possessing the power to control the power of nature. However, this also caused him to be hunted down even more fiercely by the Lotus Flower Monastery. They sent a total of 3 Xiantian grandmasters to hunt him down. Jushin naturally could not defeat the siege of 3 Xiantian grandmasters. Now that he was severely injured, he could only temporarily hide in this dilapidated temple to recuperate. When his injuries recovered a little, the 3 Xiantian grandmasters of the Lotus Flower Monastery would catch up and an intense battle would erupt. In the end, Jushin would rely on the powerful breakthrough skill he had cultivated with the Jade Bone indestructible technique to burn his life and forcefully kill the 3 Xiantian grandmasters. However, he would also be on the verge of death. In the original timeline, because the aftershock of the intense battle between the Xiantian grandmasters was extremely destructive, the father and daughter pair in the dilapidated temple, as well as the 2 constables escorting Chen Tangwen, were all killed by the aftershock. Only Chen Tangwen relied on the foundation left behind by his profound gate realm to barely survive. Hence, before Jushin died, he imparted all his cultivation skills and the Jade Bone indestructible technique to Chen Tangwen, hoping that he would rebuild the inheritance of the Immortal Wind Monastery. Unfortunately, just as Chen Tangwen finished building an Immortal Wind Monastery, the people from the Lotus Flower Monastery came looking for him. They even brought the imperial court's decree and crippled his martial cultivation again. They ordered him not to step out of Xiong County for the rest of his life. 736 Leaving a Dao Mark in the Past, 2. 736 Leaving a Dao Mark in the Past, 2. Chen Tangwen was completely discouraged after that. Later on, he heard that the Great Zhao had been attacked by the barbarians and the people in the city had been slaughtered. He cried for 3 days and 3 nights and went on a hunger strike for 7 days before dying of depression. However, this was the original history. After Kui Heng decided to go back to this time period and use Chen Tang as the entry point, history would change. When Jushin heard Kui Heng's question, he shook his head gently and said, "This poor monk is a sinful person. Benefactor, don't ask any more. There's going to be a bloody calamity here. You should leave quickly. Hey, who are you scaring, monk?" Li was a little dissatisfied. He glared and said, "In this wilderness, at most a few wild beasts will appear. We brothers can just kill them. What bloody calamity can there be?" Although he and Wang San were only constables escorting prisoners into exile, they also had extraordinary martial cultivation. They had both reached the Qi condensation realm and were considered experts in the pugilistic world. After all, to move for 3,000 miles and travel to the southern wilderness, even if it was just to escort a prisoner, ordinary people could not do it. With such martial skills, it would not be a problem for them to kill a ferocious tiger with a weapon. Naturally, they were quite bold. At this moment, Wang San also walked over. His polite attitude from before had changed. He narrowed his eyes and sized up monk Jushin before saying in a low voice, "Monk, are you here to rob the criminals?" As he spoke, he tightened his grip on the chain and even pulled Chen Tangwen a few times. On the other side, the old man saw that the atmosphere was a little off and hurriedly pulled the girl beside him to stand up. "Lord Monk, Daoist priest, and the 2 guards. I still have something urgent to attend to with my daughter, so I'll leave first." The girl timidly hid behind the old man, not daring to make a sound. Clearly, she was frightened by the current atmosphere. "Stop right there," Li Erlai shouted. He pulled out his steel saber and glared with his bell-like eyes. He berated, "No one is allowed to leave. Do you want to go out and inform the others?" No, we're not." The old man hurriedly waved his hand. He looked at the bright saber light with fear and hurriedly shielded the girl behind him. He shrank into a corner and sat down again. No one can leave now. At this moment, Chen Tangwen, who had been silent, suddenly spoke. He pointed outside and looked at Monk Jushin. Lord Monk is being hunted down by 3 Xiantian grandmasters, right? As soon as these words were spoken, the expressions on Wang San and Li Er's faces froze. They hurriedly turned their heads, their faces filled with disbelief. They almost suspected that they had heard wrongly. What nonsense are you talking about? Li Er rushed over and punched Chen Tangwen, causing him to curl up on the ground in pain. He scolded, T, how can there be Xiantian? Boom. At this moment, a thunderous sound suddenly came from outside. However, this was clearly not lightning. It was more like a huge bang caused by the surrounding void being shaken by some powerful force. Immediately after the tremor was an incomparably loud human voice that instantly spread in all directions. It even surpassed the thunder just now, as if a Vajra had descended and a lion was roaring. Remnant evil of the immortal wind monastery, are you still going to run at this point? Surrender quickly. This poor monk can still give you a chance to atone for your sins. Junior brother Jushin, don't be stubborn. Put down the butcher's knife and become a Buddha. The sound of these 3 voices completely shattered Wang San and Li Er's last trace of fantasy. Their faces turned pale as they could not help but say in shock, This is the Lotus Flower Monastery's lion's roar. It's really a Xiantian grandmaster. At the same time, the two of them looked at the middle-aged monk and felt their scalps tingle as their bodies trembled. The Xiantian grandmaster of the Lotus Flower Monastery had called him Jushin. Didn't that mean that this middle-aged monk was the remnant of the immortal wind monastery, the legendary evil monk Jushin? They had actually berated this evil monk. It's over, it's over. They were dead meat. At this moment, Chen Tangwen, who was curled up on the ground, closed his eyes and exhaled softly. His entire body relaxed, and his face revealed an expression of relief. The old man hiding in the corner shielded the girl behind him, his face filled with fear. He did not understand why their luck was so miserable. First, their hometown was robbed. Only him and his youngest daughter were still alive. On the way to escape, they even encountered heavy rain. It was not easy for them to find a dilapidated temple to avoid the rain, but they actually encountered a martial battle. Why was this happening to them? Could it be that in this world, people without power and martial cultivation were not considered humans and were not worthy of living? Jushin, who was originally sitting cross-legged on the ground, slowly stood up. He pressed his palms together and bowed to the old man and the girl, then to Chen Tangwen, Wang San, Li Er, and Kui Heng. Then, he said with a solemn expression, Amitabha, it's this poor monk's fault for implicating you. If there's a next life, this poor monk is willing to be your ox or horse to repay the sins of this life. Later, I'll do my best to hold back those 3. You should escape as soon as possible to avoid being implicated. The old man looked at Jushin, who had a benevolent expression on his face, and the grief and indignation in his heart dissipated a little. He opened his mouth, as if he wanted to say something, but in the end, he did not say anything. However, the 2 constables at the side were different. They did not believe Jushin's words at all. Later. We'll be dead if we wait until later, Leah muttered to himself in fear. At the same time, he ran out of the dilapidated temple. The aftershock of a Xiantian Grandmaster level battle is not a joke. Wang San hurriedly ran out. As well. The 2 of them had used all their strength and even used the inner qi that they had painstakingly accumulated in their bodies without holding back. They wanted to escape this troublesome place as quickly as possible. However, less than 10 minutes after they ran off, the people in the dilapidated temple heard 2 miserable screams coming from outside. It was clearly Wang San and Li Er's voices. Chen Tangwen, who was lying on the ground waiting for death, suddenly opened his eyes when he heard the 2 screams. He smiled self-deprecatingly and said, I didn't expect you to be ahead of me on the road to hell. When the old man and the girl heard the 2 screams, their bodies trembled even more visibly, and their expressions were replaced by fear again. Kui Heng sat there peacefully, as if this series of changes did not affect him. Jushin noticed that Kui Heng was different, so he asked with the mentality of giving it a try, Daoist priest, you should have quite a bit of martial cultivation, right? This poor monk has a presumptuous request. Can you escort the other benefactors out of here? I have a martial technique here that points to the peak of the inner world realm. I'll give it to you as a reward. As he spoke, he took out a book from his pocket and was about to hand it to Kui Heng. It was the jade bone indestructible technique that had changed his life. As long as these benefactors can escape safely, I won't have any regrets in my life. Ju Xin thought to himself and was about to hand the secret manual to Kui Heng. Just then. Boom. The door and walls of the dilapidated temple collapsed with a bang. 3 monks enveloped in faint golden light slowly walked in. They were the 3 Xiantian grandmasters of the Lotus Flower Monastery. A huge aura spread out, causing the heavy rain to seem to freeze for a moment. The howling wind even circled this dilapidated temple, as if it did not dare to blow past. The 3 monks had heard Ju Xin's words when they arrived outside, so they immediately attacked Ju Xin and Kui Heng. Ju Xin, at this point, you still want to hand the jade bone indestructible technique to others? How stubborn. Junior brother Ju Xin, you've gone beyond the point of hope. Amitabha, let senior brother purify you. Die, evil monk. Accompanied by the stern shouts of the 3 monks, Xiantian true qi surged out, and the natural power of heaven and earth was mobilized. Streaks of golden light lit up, actually illuminating this pitch-black rainy night as if it was daytime. Chen Tangwen closed his eyes again and waited for death. The old man also closed his eyes, not daring to look straight at the dazzling Buddha light, but he still protected his daughter behind him. Monk Ju Xin did not hold back when he saw this. His body emitted a crystal-clear light and seemed to have turned into beautiful jade, but it emitted an indestructible charm. His aura began to rise rapidly. He was burning his life and doing his best to increase his strength. At the same time, he threw the secret manual in his hand at Kui Heng and said loudly, Daoist priest, bring them away from here quickly. I'll do my best to help you delay. Buzz. At this moment, a trembling sound suddenly sounded in the void, as if it had the power to suppress everything. Everything in the world seemed to have entered a still state at this moment. Ju Xin stopped before he could finish speaking. From his perspective, Kui Heng only blew lightly like an ordinary person, but it made the entire world tremble. Xiantian grandmasters could already sense the natural energy of the world. At this moment, he only felt that the sky was wailing and the ground was crying. If they all had bodies, they would probably be kneeling in front of this young Daoist priest. It was precisely this light breath that made the 3 Lotus Flower Monastery Xiantian grandmasters disappear like dough blown by a violent wind. This, Ju Xin stood there dumbfounded. The extreme shock made him unable to even say a complete sentence. 737 Spacetime Dao stabilized, breakthrough imminent. 737 Spacetime Dao stabilized, breakthrough imminent. He blew 3 Xiantian grandmasters into ashes in one breath. What kind of power and realm was this? Peak inner world? No, even a peak inner world expert could not have such divine might. Could it be the legendary deity realm? Ju Xin's heart was in turmoil. He could hardly believe his eyes. The scene just now was too unbelievable. In the past 5 years, he had been living in exile in the pugilistic world. By chance, he had read some ancient books and learned of the existence of the deity realm through the records in the ancient books. The deity realm was the divine treasure realm. At this realm, one could open the treasures in their bodies and possess all kinds of unbelievable divine power. They could control wind, lightning, water, and fire like the legendary immortals and Buddhas. The strength Kui Heng had displayed just now had clearly exceeded the scope of ordinary martial arts. It was too exaggerated. With a single breath, he caused the world to tremble and 3 Xiantian grandmasters were reduced to ashes. Such strength was simply a crime. Only by reaching the legendary deity realm and touching the immortal and Buddhist realm could one possess such powerful strength. Thank you for saving my life, senior. Ju Xin bowed respectfully to Kui Heng. In his opinion, although Kui Heng looked very young and was only a handsome Daoist priest in his 20s, a person who could reach the deity realm was definitely more than 100 years old. The reason why he looked young was because he had experienced great fortune and regained his youth. Of course, he should call him senior. At this moment, Chen Tangwen, who was lying on the ground, opened his eyes. He first looked at the place where the 3 monks had been reduced to ashes, then at Kui Heng, who was standing not far away. Then, he was stunned. At this moment, Chen Tangwen could not tell if he was dreaming or if such a strange thing had really happened. 3 Xiantian grandmasters. They died just like that. As for the old man and the young girl, their thoughts were much simpler. After their initial shock, they immediately knelt on the ground and kowtowed, shouting, "Thank you, immortal, for saving our life." In the eyes of this father and daughter pair, Kui Heng was a living immortal who had killed the evil bandits and saved their lives. Only then did Chen Tangwen wake up from his extreme shock. He hurriedly mustered his strength and forced himself to stand up. He bowed and thanked Kui Heng very respectfully. "Thank you for saving my life, senior. Your body is really tattered." Kui Heng glanced at Chen Tangwen and could not help but shake his head. At the same time, he flicked his finger and a fiery red fruit landed in Chen Tangwen's hand. "Eat this. It can help you in recovering from your injuries." This fiery red fruit was none other than the little tomato that grew in the grotto heaven. It contained extremely dense spiritual energy and even had the effect of cleansing one's tendons and marrow, rebirth, and extending one's lifespan. Chen Tangwen respectfully held the little tomato with both hands. As soon as he touched the fruit, his palm felt a cold touch that refreshed his heart. Immediately after, this cool feeling directly passed through his limbs and bones. In an instant, his severely shattered meridians were completely repaired, and his entire body began to recover quickly. This situation caused Chen Tangwen's face to reveal an uncontrollable shock. He had yet to eat this fruit, but he actually felt such a huge healing effect. What would the effect be if he really ate it? However, although Chen Tangwen was excited, his rationality still overcame his desire for the immortal fruit. He held the little tomato with both hands and shook his head at Kui Heng. "Senior, this immortal fruit is too precious. I can't take it. It's already my fortune to be able to come into contact with this immortal fruit. Senior, please take it back." "You really don't want to take it?" Kui Heng chuckled. "I won't accept a reward for nothing. This immortal fruit is too precious. I don't dare to accept it." Chen Tangwen shook his head. "How is it precious?" Kui Heng shook his head and smiled. At the same time, he raised his finger and tapped the little tomato gently. Immediately, the little tomato flew out of Chen Tangwen's hand and landed on the ground, sinking into the soil. In the next moment, a sapling broke out of the ground. In the blink of an eye, it grew into a lush fruit tree. There were 4 sparkling and translucent tomatoes hanging on it, emitting waves of fragrance that made one feel refreshed. "There are 4 immortal fruits now. The 4 of you can each take one." Kui Heng smiled. Chen Tangwen was stunned again as he looked at the immortal fruit tree that grew in the blink of an eye. The scene just now had once again exceeded his imagination. At this moment, he also understood that this young Daoist priest was clearly an immortal walking in the mortal world. The precious immortal fruits that he thought were precious might really be ordinary in the other party's eyes. Facing the gift of such an immortal god, if he refused every time, it was very likely to make the immortal god unhappy. This was not a good way to deal with it. After thinking about this, Chen Tangwen bowed respectfully to Kui Heng and said, "Thank you for the immortal fruit, senior." With that, he walked towards the fruit tree and carefully plucked a small tomato from it. He held it in his palm respectfully. Then, Ju Xin also thanked Kui Heng and plucked a small tomato from the fruit tree. The old man and the young girl were a little hesitant. They looked at the immortal fruits on the fruit tree, but they did not dare to come over. "Come and get it." Kui Heng smiled at the 2 of them. "Thank you, immortal." The old man hurriedly pulled his daughter and thanked him. "Thank you, immortal." The girl also thanked him. Her voice was clear and very pleasant to the ears. The 4 little tomatoes quickly arrived in the hands of the 4 of them. Smelling the fragrance emitted by the immortal fruit, they could no longer hold back and placed the little tomatoes into their mouths to chew carefully. The sweet and sour juice immediately filled their mouths. Then, saliva appeared under their tongues, and their bodies felt cool. They could not help but close their eyes to savor this comfortable feeling. 738 Spacetime Dow mark stabilized, breakthrough imminent, 2. 738 Spacetime Dow mark stabilized, breakthrough imminent, 2. Immediately after, they felt a warm current appear that filled their limbs and bones, flowing through the meridians in their entire bodies, allowing them to be reborn. Chen Tangwen realized that not only had he recovered his profound gate realm cultivation, but his aptitude and foundation had also increased drastically. His future path of martial cultivation should be smooth. Zhu Xin was even more shocked and thought to himself, as expected of an immortal fruit bestowed by an immortal. It actually pushed me to the peak of the inner world realm. He had just broken through to the Xiantian realm, and now, the Xiantian true qi in his body had already exceeded the limit of the Xiantian realm. He also had some understanding of the construction of the small celestial world in his body. He estimated that he would be able to break through and become the top expert of the inner world realm in 3 to 5 days. At the same time, Zhu Xin also felt that his aptitude had increased greatly. He had been reborn, and even his essence of life seemed to have increased. The old man and the young girl did not know martial arts, so they did not have a deep understanding of it. However, they could clearly feel that their bodies had become better than ever. Originally, the old man had been ill for many years and it was not convenient for him to move around. Recently, he had been eating and sleeping while exposed to the wind. His physique was already very weak. Now, he felt as if he had returned to being 18 years old and was extremely energetic. The girl was only 14 or 15 years old, the age when she was growing up. However, because she was malnourished, her face looked sallow and her body was very petite. It was obvious that her physique was weak. After eating the little tomato, she immediately became radiant. Her skin was fair and tender, and her figure had grown a little taller. Her entire temperament had undergone an extremely huge change. The four of them bowed and thanked him. Chen Tangwen bowed to Kui Heng and asked, "May I know how I should address Immortal?" Monk Zhu Xin also nodded and asked, "That's right. Senior has done us such a great favor. Can you leave a name for us?" The old man and the girl were also looking forward to it. They also wanted to know how to address Kui Heng so that they could often pray to this immortal who had done them a great favor in the future. "You've learned my martial arts outline, but you still want my name?" Kui Heng looked at Monk Zhu Xin with a faint smile and shook the Jade Bone Indestructible Technique manual in his hand. Your martial arts general outline? Jade Bone Indestructible Technique? You are." Zhu Xin's eyes widened when he heard this. He could not help but exclaim, 700 years ago, the ancestral master of the Immortal Wind Monastery met Immortal Dao Hengzi on Wuxia Mountain and the latter imparted his cultivation technique. He obtained a volume of the Jade Bone Indestructible Technique. You are Immortal Dao Hengzi? What do you think?" The corners of Kui Heng's mouth curled up slightly as he looked at Monk Zhu Xin. At the same time, his body emitted a crystalline jade-like light, and his entire body became incomparably holy, as if an immortal had descended from the sky. Jade Bone Lifelight. Zhu Xin looked at the light emitted by Kui Heng's body and said in shock, "This is the legendary realm of the Jade Bone Indestructible Technique. It's far above the 9th level. It's said to contain the mysteries of immortal ascension, but it's long been lost. You're really Senior Dao Hengzi." Senior. Kui Heng's eyes narrowed. Ancestral Master. Zhu Xin was enlightened and immediately knelt on the ground. He said extremely respectfully, "Disciple of Immortal Wind Monastery, Zhu Xin, greets Ancestral Master." He had cultivated the ultimate technique of the Immortal Wind Monastery and was the last successor of the Immortal Wind Monastery. He was also a publicly acknowledged remnant of the Immortal Wind Monastery in the pugilistic world. It was not a problem for him to call himself a disciple of the Immortal Wind Monastery. Very good. Kui Heng nodded and smiled. He was very satisfied with Zhu Xin's reaction. Then, he said to Chen Tangwen, "Are you willing to join the Immortal Wind Monastery?" "I'm willing. Greetings, Ancestral Master." Chen Tangwen immediately kowtowed. No one would let go of a chance to be recruited by an immortal. At this moment, the old man mustered his courage and stepped forward to ask, "Immortal, my daughter has been smart since she was young. Can she also join your Immortal Wind Monastery?" At the same time, the girl knelt down in front of Kui Heng and said respectfully, "Lord Immortal, please take me in." "What's your name?" Kui Heng looked at the girl. "My name is Jiang Shi, and carries the meaning of a flowing river," the girl replied. "All right." Kui Heng nodded slightly and said, "From now on, Jushin will hold onto my inheritance and change from a monk to a Daoist. He will rebuild the Immortal Wind Monastery and be in the same generation as Chen Tangwen. Jushin will be the elder brother, Tangwen will be the younger brother, and Jiang Shi will be their disciple. Disciple will follow ancestral master's orders. Disciple will follow ancestral master's orders. Disciple will follow ancestral master's orders. Jushin, Chen Tangwen, and Jiang Shi said in unison. At this moment, Kui Heng could clearly feel that his spatial Dao mark had become more distinct. As long as the inheritance of the Immortal Wind Monastery was stabilized, he could stabilize the identity of the ancestral master of the Immortal Wind Monastery and become a real existence in the River of Time. He could use this identity to rewind time and occupy the timeline. Actually, Kui Heng had not been the ancestral master of the Immortal Wind Monastery for long, and he had just obtained this identity. This was an idea he had after seeing Monk Jushin's past. Through investigating Monk Jushin's past, Kui Heng learned that the ancestral master of Immortal Wind Monastery had actually obtained a nameless martial technique manual from the mountain. This ancestral master of the Immortal Wind Monastery had cultivated to the peak of the inner world realm without a master. From then on, he would dominate the world and finally establish the Immortal Wind Monastery. In Kui Heng's opinion, this was a good spacetime entry point. He could try to form a spacetime Dao mark at this time. Hence, just as Monk Jushin was about to exhaust his life essence to stop the three Xiantian grandmasters, Kui Heng went back 700 years and replaced the nameless martial technique manual. He became the immortal that the founder of the Immortal Wind Monastery met and became the ancestral master of Immortal Wind Monastery. In other words, in that short period of time, the memories of Jushin and everyone on Daoju Star who knew about the Immortal Wind Monastery had changed. That was because the past of the Immortal Wind Monastery had been changed. However, none of them knew or discovered any of this. After making this change, Kui Heng realized that he had successfully left a Dao mark 700 years ago. At the same time, his identity at this time suddenly became more corporeal. Clearly, this was because both of the identities were Dao Hengzi. The Dao mark left behind 700 years ago had successfully continued to the current identity of the Dao mark and formed a unity. This also allowed Kui Heng to discover that leaving behind a spatial Dao mark did not seem to be as troublesome as he had imagined. There was no need for him to create a real period of history himself. As long as he chose a suitable entry point in the original normal history and embedded his identity as a Dao mark, replacing an element in the original history, he could naturally form a Dao mark. However, the Dao mark formed like this was not stable. He had to extend the identity of this Dao mark into the subsequent timeline and let two or more points of time form a unified and connected path to form a stable Dao mark. This time, through the backtracking of the 2 points, Kui Heng was very close to stabilizing the two spatial Dao marks. When the inheritance of the Immortal Wind Monastery was fully established, the identity of the ancestral master of the Immortal Wind Monastery would be completely stabilized. The entire process would not take more than 30 years. At that time, Kui Heng could attempt to break through to the late-stage Void Return realm by retracing the timeline where the spatial Dao mark was. However, this new idea of establishing a spatial Dao mark also inevitably gave Kui Heng an idea. Since I can form a spatial Dao mark by replacing an element in the original history, can I also replace a specific person? If I go back in time to the birth of the three sages of heaven, earth, and man, and I'm powerful enough, can I replace one of them? If my strength reaches a certain level, and I return to the beginning and birth of everything, will I be able to? 739 The Dao mark is about to condense. 739 The Dao mark is about to condense. Kui Heng stopped thinking. Whether it was going back to the birth of the three sages of heaven, earth, and man, or the birth of the beginning and end, it was very far away for him. After all, before breaking through to the late-stage return to Void Realm, even returning to the time when the 9 immortal ancestors were born was still a very dangerous thing. The most important thing now was to take good care of the Immortal Wind Monastery. Only when the inheritance of the Immortal Wind Monastery stabilized could his identity as the ancestral master of the Immortal Wind Monastery be completely fixed and become true history in this period of time. If an expert crossed time and attacked during this process to modify the timeline of this period, it would be very troublesome. If someone erased the existence of the Immortal Wind Monastery or cut off Quiheng's relationship with the Immortal Wind Monastery and affected the stability of the spatial Dao mark, then this spatial Dao mark would naturally collapse. It would be impossible to form, let alone use it to break through to the late-stage return to Void Realm. Therefore, in the next 50 years, Quiheng planned to take good care of the Immortal Wind Monastery and ensure the stable inheritance of the Immortal Wind Monastery. He could not be disturbed in such a critical period. In order not to affect the established history too much, Immortal Wind Monastery can't do much. Quiheng thought to himself, but if I want to leave behind a spatial Dao mark, I have to let the people of this time period know what the ancestral master of Immortal Wind Monastery is like. This also means that we can't really do nothing. I have to grasp the extent of the influence well. If he wanted the world to have a clearer understanding of the Immortal Wind Monastery, but he could not let the existence of the Immortal Wind Monastery affect the development of established history, the most suitable choice was obviously, let the Immortal Wind Monastery become a world-renowned hidden sect. The so-called hidden sects were sects that specially chose to live in seclusion for some reason and did not openly take in disciples. There were also very few disciples who were known to the outside world. Such sects generally had a long history. In the past, they might have been famous sects in the world. However, later on, for a series of reasons, they left the pugilistic world and hid behind the scenes. However, although hidden sects were hidden from the sights of the pugilistic world, it did not mean that they were weak. In fact, hidden sects were usually extremely powerful and had strength that far exceeded mortal sects. That was because every time someone from a hidden sect appeared, it would cause a huge commotion in the pugilistic world. It might even alarm the top sects and holy lands in the world, such as the Daoi Palace and the Baolin Buddhist Hall. As a result, even though the hidden sects usually did not appear in the pugilistic world, the experts in the mortal world still knew a lot about the hidden sects. There would still be world-renowned hidden sects. Of course, he still had to consider carefully how to do it. After all, because of the continuous stigmatization of Lotus Flower Monastery in recent decades, the name Immortal Wind Monastery had already become synonymous with the evil sects. Martial artists related to the Immortal Wind Monastery were called remnants of the Immortal Wind Monastery and were hunted by all the martial artists in the world. He had to do something stunning to reverse the image of the Immortal Wind Monastery in people's hearts. This was the most important thing. At the same time, it could kill many birds with one stone. As long as they did something stunning enough, not only could they reverse the image of Immortal Wind Monastery in people's hearts, but they could also let more people know about the existence and strength of the Immortal Wind Monastery. However, the problem was what kind of thing would be stunning enough. In addition, he had to consider what was most suitable. However, there was no hurry to consider this question. It would not be too late to consider it after confirming the location for the establishment of the Immortal Wind Monastery. As for the choice of Mountain Gate encampment, Quiheng already had a plan. At this moment, the weather outside the dilapidated temple had returned to normal. A bright moon hung high in the sky, and the bright moonlight shone down, making the dilapidated temple as bright as day. Quiheng said to the three people who had just entered the Immortal Wind Monastery and the old man, "Next, I'll bring you to the new encampment of the Immortal Wind Monastery. Don't panic." Chen Tangwen, Ju Xin, Jiang Shi, and the old man nodded respectfully. At the same time, Quiheng's words made them feel very strange. What kind of place was the new encampment of the Immortal Wind Monastery? The ancestral master was actually worried that they would panic. Of course, they were quickly exposed to the source of this panic. The wind in the sky whistled past their ears like a hurricane, and countless clouds retreated quickly on both sides of them. The mountains and rivers below became like paintings on paper, becoming very small. Flight. And this was flying with several people in tow. Quiheng brought Chen Tangwen, Ju Xin, Jiang Shi, and the old man to the camp he had chosen. They rode the clouds and flew in the air. This speed was already the result of him trying his best to suppress his strength. It only displayed the flying standard of a foundation establishment cultivator. But even so, it really exceeded the four people's worldview. After all, even Jueshin, who had the highest cultivation realm among the four of them, was only at the Xiantian realm. He did not have the ability to fly at all, and he had never experienced being carried into the sky. However, after the huge shock, he understood that this magical method could also be achieved through cultivation. Chen Tangwen's mood became much calmer. As long as he cultivated hard with the ancestral master, he would be able to fly in the future. Chen Tangwen was filled with expectations for the future. In comparison, the depression from being fired and released from the capital had calmed down a lot. In a good mood, he began to pay attention to the situation on the ground below. Soon, he realized that there were two large groups of people gathered in a wasteland. These people were all wearing armor, horses, and crossbows. They were clearly soldiers. However, there were some differences in appearance. To Chen Tangwen, who was once the Minister of War, he could easily distinguish the factions of the two armies. One of them should be the Great Xia army. The other party was clearly weaker than Great Xia in terms of weapons and armor, but there were many cavalry. They should be the barbarians from the four northern states. These barbarians could actually challenge Great Xia. Chen Tangwen was a little surprised to see this. 740 The Dao mark is about to condense, 2. 740 The Dao mark is about to condense, 2. When he was still in service of the country, he had once insisted to let Great Zhao attack Great Xia in the north and recover their lost land. Therefore, he knew very well that this was definitely not a weak country. If the Great Xia was weak, there would not be so many people objecting to his proposal to attack. But what was going on now? Even someone as powerful as the Great Xia was actually fighting the barbarians in the extreme north. Under normal circumstances, shouldn't the Great Xia crush these barbarian tribes in the four northern states with ease? After all, in the eyes of the four countries of the Central Plains, the four northern states were bitter and cold places. It was almost impossible for the people to survive normally. The barbarians there were also weak and could be bullied by others. When did these barbarians become so powerful? Chen Tangwen stared at the battle below. The more he looked, the more shocked he became. He did not even notice that Kui Heng had stopped flying on the cloud. At this moment, both sides had already begun to fight. With the advantage of the cavalry, the barbarians actually had the absolute advantage and suppressed Great Xia's army. After a few rounds of cavalry charge, the Great Xia army actually began to collapse. A large number of soldiers scattered in all directions and fled with all their might. After a few rounds of cavalry charge, the Great Xia army actually began to collapse. A large number of soldiers scattered in all directions and fled with all their might. How is this possible? Chen Tangwen was shocked and almost could not believe his eyes. He muttered, "This is the Great Xia army. This is Great Xia." All along, Great Zhao and Great Xia were like old enemies. The two sides would fight frequently. In the end, although both sides enjoyed some wins and losses, Great Xia was still slightly stronger. They even relied on a few key victories to occupy a few of Great Zhao's territory. Now, the Great Xia soldiers who could defeat Great Zhao were actually defeated so quickly by this group of barbarians. If it were the Great Zhao army. No, how did this happen? Chen Tangwen shook his head, his face slightly pale. Actually, he already had an answer in his heart. If this group of barbarians attacked Great Zhao's army, the outcome would definitely be much easier than attacking Great Xia's army. If one day, these ignorant people broke through Great Xia and continued to attack Great Zhao from the south, it would probably be impossible for Great Zhao to resist. What do you think? Kui Heng's voice sounded from the side. Chen Tangwen suddenly woke up. After regaining his senses, he hurriedly bowed to Kui Heng and said, "Ancestral Master, disciple was in a daze. You were still the Minister of War of Great Zhao previously. It would be strange if you didn't become dazed when you saw this situation." Kui Heng chuckled and said, "Let's go. Cultivate well in the temple in the future. After you transcend the mortal world, you will discover that the changes in the dynasties of the mortal world are just fleeting clouds. It's not worth your attention. Ancestral Master, I'm afraid I can't ignore these things for the rest of my life, Chen Tangwen said solemnly. Even if it's not for Great Zhao, it's for the people. I'll ask you again after your cultivation is successful, Kui Heng said with a smile. Actually, he had already guessed what Chen Tangwen would do in the future. This matched his concept of molding Immortal Wind Monastery into a hidden sect. Then, Kui Heng brought Chen Tangwen, Zhu Xin, Jiangxi, and the old man to continue flying northeast. After arriving at a quiet valley, they landed. He raised his hand gently and waved it. A large empty space appeared in the valley. Immediately after, an ancient Daoist temple was built out of thin air. The words written on the plaque in front of this Daoist temple were Immortal Wind Monastery. In the future, this will be the base of the Immortal Wind Monastery. Kui Heng smiled and said, I'll teach you the martial techniques of the Immortal Wind Monastery here. Just cultivate properly. With that, he took out 3 more little tomatoes from the grotto heaven and threw them to Chen Tangwen, Juexin, and Jiangxi. You can plant these 3 fruits and take good care of them in the future. You can obtain 3 fruit trees. Chen Tangwen, Juexin, and Jiangxi hurriedly bowed and thanked him. Thank you for your gift, Ancestral Master. Thank you for your gift, Ancestral Master. Thank you for your gift, Ancestral Master. After Kui Heng brought the 3 people from Immortal Wind Monastery here. In the next 10 years, he never left this valley. He taught the 3 of them martial cultivation all day long, guiding them in their cultivation doubts and teaching them carefully. Monk Zhu Xin had already unlocked the divine treasures in his body and possessed several powerful special abilities. He had successfully stepped into the deity realm. Chen Tangwen had already established a small world and stepped into the inner world realm. He had become a top expert in the world that was rarely seen. Jiangxi, this little girl, had also improved at lightning speed. In just 10 years, she had already reached the peak of the Qi transformation realm and was about to open the profound gate between her brows and become a grandmaster. The days seemed to continue peacefully without any waves. However, on this day, Chen Tangwen suddenly found Kui Heng. As soon as they met, he knelt on the ground and said respectfully, Ancestral Master, I want to leave the temple for a period of time. Oh! Kui Heng raised his eyebrows slightly when he heard that. He said calmly, as expected, you still can't let go. Did you hear the news when you were out shopping? The valley where the Immortal Wind Monastery was located was isolated from the world, but the people here were not completely cut off from the outside world. Every 7 days, Chen Tangwen would go out to buy some food. At the same time, he would inquire about the outside world and understand the situation outside. Just a few days ago, there was news from the Great Zhao that the barbarians had marched south and were about to reach Linjing City. If this continued, Great Zhao's Linjing City would be breached. At that time, the last Central Plains dynasty would be destroyed by the barbarians of the extreme north, and countless commoners would be slaughtered. This was something Chen Tangwen could not accept. Ancestral Master, please fulfill my wish. Chen Tangwen lowered his head and said extremely sincerely, I promise not to reveal my identity as a disciple of the Immortal Wind Monastery and not let incur the rage of the barbarians against us. No. Kui Heng interrupted Chen Tangwen's words and said in a low voice, I can allow you to go out, but you don't have to hide your identity as a disciple of the Immortal Wind Monastery. If the barbarians dare to come here, there's no need for them to go back. Yes. Thank you, Ancestral Master. Chen Tangwen immediately revealed an ecstatic expression. In his opinion, obtaining the Ancestral Master's support was more important than anything else. Then, after some preparation, Chen Tangwen left the calm valley and the peaceful Immortal Wind Monastery, embarking on the path back to the capital. He had gone to relieve the regret in his heart, and also to protect the countless citizens of Linjing and even Great Zhao so that they would not be slaughtered by the barbarians. A month later, news about Chen Tangwen spread throughout the world. When the barbarian army besieged the capital of Great Zhao, Chen Tangwen, who had been stripped of his position and exiled to the southern border, suddenly returned. At this moment, Chen Tangwen claimed to be a disciple of the Immortal Wind Monastery and possessed extremely powerful strength. When he was guarding the city, he actually used his top-notch martial technique to rush into the middle of the army and took the head of the barbarian general as if he had entered an uninhabited place. Such an action caused chaos in the barbarian army. They could only retreat helplessly, allowing Great Zhao to regain a chance to breathe. As soon as the news was released, the world was shocked. The discussion about Chen Tangwen and Immortal Wind Monastery suddenly became the most popular topic in the world. At the same time, Kui Heng, who was in the Immortal Wind Monastery, could clearly feel that his Dao mark as the ancestral master of the Immortal Wind Monastery had become more corporeal. Soon, he could go back in time. The late-stage return to Void Realm was right in front of him. 741 Beginning Breakthrough. 741 Beginning Breakthrough. Chen Tangwen had reappeared in the world and had even become a top expert. He had also done such an earth-shattering thing and instantly became world-renowned. The Immortal Wind Monastery he came from naturally attracted the attention of many people. Actually, the pugilistic world was not unfamiliar with the Immortal Wind Monastery. More than 100 years ago, the Immortal Wind Monastery was still a world-renowned Orthodox Daoist sect. The patriarch had even cultivated to the inner world realm and become an expert at the peak of the pugilistic world. It could definitely be considered a famous sect. However, decades ago, the Lotus Flower Monastery, a large Buddhist sect, suddenly announced a piece of shocking news to the world. The patriarch of the Immortal Wind Monastery secretly used the blood of children's hearts to cultivate an evil technique. He even took out a bottle of blood as evidence. Then, under the guise of enforcing justice on behalf of the heavens, they encircled the Immortal Wind Monastery. In the end, the Immortal Wind Monastery was completely destroyed. The countless books in the temple were all transported back to their sect by the Lotus Flower Monastery and sealed in the scripture depository. At that time, there were also rumors that the accusations made by the Lotus Flower Monastery against the Immortal Wind Monastery were purely false. The patriarch of the Immortal Wind Monastery had never cultivated any evil techniques. The true goal of the Lotus Flower Monastery was actually to use this as an excuse to destroy the Immortal Wind Monastery so that they could take the opportunity to snatch the martial techniques passed down by the temple. In the end, they could change it into the Buddhist martial techniques passed down in the Lotus Flower Monastery. It was from that time that the Immortal Wind Monastery disappeared from the pugilistic world. As time passed, not many people mentioned it. It was only a few years ago when the Lotus Flower Monastery hunted after monk Jushin all over the world and called him a remnant of the Immortal Wind Monastery that the name of this sect returned to the public eye. But that was all. It did not cause much waves in the pugilistic world. In fact, not many people paid attention to the so-called remnants of the Immortal Wind Monastery. But it was different now. The barbarians from the 4 northern states had been attacking cities and plundering land in the past 10 years. Great Xia, Great Chen, and Great Yang had already been destroyed by the barbarians. Only Great Zhao was left in the central plains. If the Great Zhao was also destroyed by the barbarians, then the entire central plains would be completely invaded by these barbarians, and the people here would definitely be reduced to inferior citizens. Not many people could accept such an outcome. However, to most people, their individual strength was unable to compete with an army at all. They could only watch helplessly as the barbarians headed south and even surrounded the capital of Great Zhao. Under such circumstances, Chen Tangwen suddenly appeared and even rushed into the barbarian army, killing the barbarian general who led the troops. He forced the barbarians to retreat and saved the Linjing city that was about to fall. All of this matched the definition of a hero in the hearts of countless people. Naturally, it caused a huge commotion and shook the world. It was also strange that such a person came from the Immortal Wind Monastery that had long been destroyed by the Lotus Flower Monastery. What was the situation with the Immortal Wind Monastery? Why did it suddenly appear again? Was it really destroyed by the Lotus Flower Monastery decades ago? What was the truth back then? These questions became the most discussed topic in the world. While the news about Chen Tangwen and the Immortal Wind Monastery spread throughout the world, Chen Tangwen had already arrived at the Linjing imperial palace that he had not seen for more than 10 years. It was the current emperor of Great Zhao who had summoned him. Walking in the familiar palace wall, Chen Tangwen could not help but sigh. More than 10 years ago, when he left here, he was shackled and convicted. His martial cultivation was abolished, and he was stripped of his position as a citizen and exiled from the capital. When he returned here again, he was welcomed back with extremely high etiquette. The current emperor of Great Zhao was no longer the same person who had demoted Chen Tangwen back then. 7 years ago, that emperor died of illness. After that, the crown prince ascended the throne and was named Emperor Dayo. It was the 7th year of Dayo now. Chen Tangwen walked into the palace in a daoist robe. His gaze swept across the left and right sides. There were hundreds of officials bowing their heads. He looked up and saw a young face on the jade steps at the end of the palace. He was the former crown prince and the current emperor. His actions made all the officials present tremble in fear. Some of the more timid people broke out in cold sweat. This fellow was really bold. He actually dared to look directly at the officials in the imperial court. However, as an expert who had cultivated to the inner world realm and had already reached the peak of the world in terms of martial strength, he did seem to have such confidence. After sizing up the emperor on the jade steps for a moment, Chen Tangwen cupped his hands and said, "Greetings, sir." Such a method of greeting the emperor was unprecedented. However, no one in the imperial court criticized him. Even the emperor on the jade steps still looked at him with a smile. Lord Chen's return has resolved the danger of the imperial city. You can be said to have done a great deed, Emperor Zhao said with a smile. I want you to be the prime minister and lead the country's military. How about that? As soon as these words were spoken, the expression of an old man standing at the front of the court changed. His beard trembled slightly, and his mouth opened slightly, as if he wanted to say something, but in the end, he lowered his head and said nothing. Seeing that the old man did not say anything, the other officials stopped their thoughts and continued to remain silent. There's no need for that. Chen Tangwen shook his head and refused. He said indifferently, "From the day I was demoted and exiled from the capital, I've had nothing to do with the imperial court. I'm only a disciple of the Immortal Wind Monastery now. I came to the capital this time to protect the citizens of my hometown and prevent them from dying tragically under the butcher's knife of the barbarians. I don't want to return to the imperial court." The main hall immediately fell silent. His words really challenged the understanding of the officials in the current dynasty. Prime Minister. This was the position of Prime Minister that could overturn the world. He rejected it so easily. Emperor Zhao did not expect Chen Tangwen to refuse so bluntly, but he still maintained a kind expression and smiled. Since Lord Chen doesn't want an official position, he should at least be rewarded. Otherwise, the world will probably say that I'm mean. I do have something to trouble you with, Chen Tangwen said in a low voice. Decades ago, the reputation of the Immortal Wind Monastery was tainted by the Lotus Flower Monastery. It's still affected today. Emperor, please issue an edict to announce to the world that the Immortal Wind Monastery is an orthodox Daoist sect and a righteous sect. It has never cultivated any crooked evil techniques. Please maintain our reputation. 742 Beginning Breakthrough. 2. 742 Beginning Breakthrough. 2. This was a request he had long thought of, and he also wanted to use it to thank his ancestral master. However, after Emperor Zhao heard Chen Tangwen's words, he could not help but frown. After a long while, he said, "Lord Chen, can you change your request?" "What?" Chen Tangwen also frowned and looked at Emperor Zhao on the jade steps. His eyes narrowed slightly as he said in a low voice, "Are you worried about the Lotus Flower Monastery?" If an edict was issued to show that the Immortal Wind Monastery was an orthodox sect of the Dao sects and the Xian sects, it would actually be equivalent to saying that the Lotus Flower Monastery was slandering the Immortal Wind Monastery back then. Since Lord Chen knows, why make this request? Emperor Zhao's expression turned colder as he said indifferently, "Lord Chen, you should know better than me what kind of foundation and power the Lotus Flower Monastery has." Short-sighted. Chen Tangwen did not continue explaining. He flicked his sleeve and left. He turned around and left the palace. From now on, I'll only protect the people in the city. You can only hope that luck is on your side. Before he could finish speaking, he had already disappeared, leaving behind the emperor and ministers who looked at each other in the hall. Boom. After a while, a loud bang suddenly came from the main hall. Immediately after, the court assembly dispersed, and the officials left in a hurry as if they were fleeing for their lives. Later on, there were rumors that the emperor had broken the armrest of the dragon throne in his anger. Along with this rumor, there was also the news that Chen Tangwen would rather give up the title of prime minister in the royal court to clear the name of the Immortal Wind Monastery. This once again caused a large-scale discussion in the civilian martial arts world. For a moment, the Immortal Wind Monastery was in the limelight again. More and more people paid attention to whether the Lotus Flower Monastery had slandered the Immortal Wind Monastery back then. At the same time, many people also found out the reason why the Immortal Wind Monastery reappeared in the world. The immortal who had given the Immortal Wind Monastery's patriarch the martial technique 700 years ago had descended personally. This undoubtedly added to the legendary color of the Immortal Wind Monastery again. It began to attract more people's attention and became more and more famous. Of course, in contrast, the reputation of the Lotus Flower Monastery plummeted. More and more people thought that the Lotus Flower Monastery had framed the Immortal Wind Monastery back then with the goal of snatching the martial techniques of the Immortal Wind Monastery. As for the bottle of so-called heart blood of young children, it was very likely faked with pig or duck blood. Various jokes about the Lotus Flower Monastery even began to spread in the martial world of Great Zhao. However, as the Great Zhao Imperial Court strictly controlled such comments and captured the creator of the rumors, these jokes about the Lotus Flower Monastery quickly disappeared. No one dared to discuss the Lotus Flower Monastery anymore. Not even many people dared to talk about the Immortal Wind Monastery. However, at this point, the existence of the Immortal Wind Monastery was already deeply imprinted in everyone's hearts. Whether it was the martial artists or ordinary people, they all remembered the existence of such a sect. On a mountain peak outside Linjing, Zhu Xin, who had already grown his hair out and was wearing a Daoist robe, stood beside Chen Tangwen. He looked at the distant Linjing city and smiled. "Junior brother, what do you think? Great Zhao is hopeless." Chen Tangwen shook his head. He was completely disappointed. After this battle, the barbarians have already realized the importance of top martial arts experts, Zhu Xin said in a low voice. The next time they come to attack Linjing City, there should be top experts accompanying the army. I'm not weaker than anyone below the deity realm. Chen Tangwen's gaze was still firm. I'll stay here and try my best to protect the people. The ancestral master asked me to pay attention to your safety. Zhu Xin sighed softly. In case you die. Chen Tangwen fell silent for a moment before saying with a bitter smile, I've let ancestral master down. Ancestral master will be satisfied if you can return alive. Zhu Xin patted Chen Tangwen's shoulder gently. At the critical moment, I'll save you. Senior brother, there should be people from the Lotus Flower Monastery watching over your every move. Don't take risks because of me. Chen Tangwen shook his head and said, I can handle it. This is an order from the ancestral master. Don't refuse, Zhu Xin said in a low voice. Then I'll have to trouble senior brother. Chen Tangwen sighed. As Chen Tangwen no longer interfered with the city defense and only ensured the safety of ordinary people, when Linjing City was besieged by the barbarians again, the city gate was almost breached. The reason why it was not broken was because the top expert of the Lotus Flower Monastery had appeared. He planned to imitate Chen Tangwen and turn the tide. However, he did not expect that there would also be 3 top experts in the barbarian army this time. This top expert of Lotus Flower Monastery was severely injured on the spot and fled. However, just as the barbarian army was about to charge into the capital, Chen Tangwen stood up again and requested that the barbarians not harm the people after entering the city. Otherwise, he would take their general's head again. This naturally attracted the ridicule of the barbarian soldiers. The barbarian general even threatened to massacre the entire Linjing city after entering the city. However, after hearing their mockery, Chen Tangwen flew down from the city wall and rushed into the army as if he had entered an uninhabited place. The three top experts could not even catch the corner of his clothes. They could only watch helplessly as he took the head of the general and left. The barbarians' attack on Linjing City was neutralized again, and they had no choice but to retreat. After the news of this battle spread, Chen Tangwen and the Immortal Wind Monastery became the most commonly mentioned names in the world again. Many people began to search for the whereabouts of the Immortal Wind Monastery, wanting to become their disciples and learn martial arts, but they could not find any clues. However, the barbarians did not give up on attacking Linjing City. After another half a year, they actually organized an army again and even invited 5 top experts to hold the line and attack Linjing City again. Chen Tangwen's request was the same as last time. As long as they did not hurt the people of Great Zhao, he could ignore the matters of the city defense. This time, the barbarians agreed readily. The Linjing City was immediately lost. Emperor Zhao, who was in the palace, was so frightened that he abandoned the city and fled. Most of the officials in the dynasty also fled. However, after entering the city, the barbarians broke their promise and started to massacre the city. Chen Tangwen was furious. He actually killed his way through the barbarian army alone with a single sword by his side. Not only did he take the head of the general, but he also killed more than half of the barbarian soldiers. The 5 top experts were all killed. This battle shook the world. The barbarians completely gave up on attacking Linjing City. Even after taking down the other cities, they would treat the people well and not dare to slaughter the commoners again, afraid that Chen Tangwen would kill his way over. At the same time, the barbarians turned their main attention to chasing after Emperor Zhao, who had escaped from the city. In the end, Emperor Zhao was captured by the senior monks of the Lotus Flower Monastery during his escape and handed over to the barbarian generals chasing after him. From then on, Great Zhao was destroyed and the barbarians completely occupied the Central Plains. As the Lotus Flower Monastery had contributed greatly to capturing Emperor Zhao, they were later treated as esteemed guests in the Dayuan imperial court. They received huge support in terms of resources and quickly grew stronger. After the establishment of Dayuan, Chen Tangwen returned to the Immortal Wind Monastery and no longer cared about the affairs of the mortal world. He had successfully protected the people from slaughter. His wish had been fulfilled, and he would focus on cultivating from now on. Although the Immortal Wind Monastery had never really appeared after that, through Chen Tangwen's series of actions, the name of this sect had already been deeply rooted in the hearts of the people. Even ordinary people knew that it was the people from the Immortal Wind Monastery who had saved them in the chaos at the end of the dynasty. Many people even posted statues of the ancestral master of the Immortal Wind Monastery in their houses to pray for the safety and health of their families. At this point, Kui Heng's spatial Dao mark had finally completely condensed. He could return his existence to a time point that originally did not exist. In the current spacetime dimension, Kui Heng, who was standing in the Chaos Sea, suddenly opened his eyes. His entire body began to emit a bright silver light. Light and shadows flickered around him, and an illusory river of time appeared. The river water inside boiled and surged. Begin breakthrough. 743 Late-stage return to Void Realm, because it's ancient, it's powerful, because it's powerful, it's ancient. 743 Late-stage return to Void Realm, because it's ancient, it's powerful, because it's powerful, it's ancient. The moment Kui Heng chose to start breaking through, the river of time surged violently. At the same time, all the spells he had cultivated and all the great Tao he had grasped ever since he started cultivating transformed into layers of phenomena that appeared around him. Light and shadows of fire dragons condensed, and lightning gathered into an ocean. There were also phantoms that looked like immortals and gods that appeared one after another. There were the 3 heads 6 arms, the heavenly transformation, layers of void opening up, and chaos splitting. These countless phenomena gathered into an incomparably huge auspicious cloud that floated above Kui Heng's head, enveloping everything, as if he had transformed into the source of all techniques and Tao. Then, at the core of this auspicious cloud, endless laws and Tao began to collide with each other, entangling and fusing with each other, gradually condensing into an indescribable ball of light. This ball of light seemed to be black and white at the same time. It was endlessly large and also incredibly small. It also appeared to be constantly moving or in a motionless state. All kinds of completely contradictory states appeared on its body. In Kui Heng's perception, this ball of light was actually an external projection of his life of cultivation, the manifestation of his cultivation. The appearance of this ball of light actually meant that his cultivation realm had broken through and to a certain extent, reached the so-called perfection level. At this moment, Kui Heng clearly felt that his true spirit had begun to sublimate to the extreme and ascend to an endless height, as if it wanted to completely transcend the river of time and look down on the present and the past from a higher perspective. Crash! The crisp sound of water flowing suddenly appeared in his perception. This was the sound produced by the river of time. At some point, two tributaries extended out of the originally illusory river and wrapped around him, as if they were stopping him from escaping the river of time. No, it was not just to stop him. When Kui Heng heard the sound of water crashing, he immediately felt that the sublimation speed of his true spirit had slowed down, as if it was restrained by something invisible. Immediately after, he felt his true spirit suddenly sink. It actually stopped the process of sublimating to an endless height and began to interweave with the power of time, sinking into the river of time. The river of time is pulling me back. Kui Heng was extremely surprised. This was the first time he had encountered such a situation. If his true spirit was really entangled by this power of time and pulled back into the river of time, the consequences would not be as simple as a failed breakthrough. First of all, as his true spirit had intertwined with a large amount of time power, if it was pulled back into the river of time, it meant that he would no longer have the characteristics of transcending time, and his influence on the past would decrease rapidly. At the same time, he would also lose the time manipulation characteristics of a return to void cultivator and become similar to an immortal emperor who was entangled with a large amount of time power. There was no possibility of him breaking through to the late-stage return to void realm. However, at this moment, Kui Heng suddenly stopped what he was doing and looked up. There was Kui Heng, who was exploring the primordial world, Kui Heng, who was exploring the endless universe of the Chaos Sea, Kui Heng, who was in the Silver Disk Star Sea, and Kui Heng, who was in the Heaven Realm, the Five Views Realm, the Heavenly Void World, Daoju Star, and other spacetime dimensions. All of them felt something. I'm going to break through. I'm going to break through. I'm going to break through. All the Kui Hengs shouted the same words, overlapping and reaching the river of time. At the same time, their faces revealed the same expression of joy. Their essence suddenly sublimated to the extreme. No matter what realm they were originally at, all the Kui Hengs instantly reached the late-stage void return realm. Then, they left their original time spectrum and arrived above the river of time, turning into countless lights and shadows that rushed down towards Kui Heng. The current Kui Heng and the previous Kui Hengs quickly gathered together. Countless lights and shadows appeared around him. They all looked like Kui Heng. Moreover, there was an auspicious cloud above each Kui Heng's head that gathered endless Dharma and Tao. They were also accompanied by an incomparably mysterious ball of light. This was a unity of the present and the past. These Kui Hengs of the past surrounded the current Kui Heng, suppressing the power of time that was entangled with him and working together to continue sublimating his current self. The breakthrough continued. As his true spirit continued to sublimate, the range of light from the auspicious cloud above his head became wider and wider, easily covering the timeline that Kui Heng had already occupied. From the time Kui Heng walked out of the beginner's space until now, the light of the great Tao laws he evolved illuminated the boundless chaos universe and the primordial world, directly forming a series of natural laws. This was the greatest change in the boundless chaos universe and the primordial world since the transformation of the three supreme gods. Before this, no one had ever achieved such an achievement. Whether it was the immortal ancestors of the primordial world or the heaven-earth saints of the boundless chaos sea, they were essentially gathering the power left behind by the three supreme gods. However, the changes caused by Kui Heng's breakthrough was different. Through his own cultivation, he evolved his dharmic powers into endless great Tao and endless laws. These great Tao laws covered the timeline occupied by Kui Heng, forming object laws in each universe and the primordial world. Therefore, Kui Heng could directly leverage the power of many universes and the primordial world through this portion of the Great Tao laws. This also meant that as long as one was within the timeline he occupied and in a universe where his fake selves existed, the power of the Great Tao laws of all spacetime could be mobilized by him. Now, my dharmic powers should be close to the immortal ancestor realm. Next, as long as I improve in the reversal of the timeline and the occupation of space, I can continue to become stronger. Kui Heng thought to himself. 744 Late stage return to Void Realm, because it's ancient, it's powerful, because it's powerful, it's ancient. 2. 744 Late stage return to Void Realm, because it's ancient, it's powerful, because it's powerful, it's ancient. 2. At the same time, he comprehended his current state and made a judgment of his strength. The reason why the immortal ancestors and the heaven-earth saints were powerful was because they could rely on the remnants of the three supreme gods' Tao transformations to mobilize endless power. Moreover, they could mobilize all the power on the time spectrum from the time of the three supreme gods' Tao transformations to the current time. Kui Heng could only have an absolute advantage in the time periods that he occupied. That was because he had only let his fake selves occupy all the universes in this time period. He had yet to reach this realm in the time period of the past. However, this was only the current situation, and it did not mean that the late-stage return to Void Realm was only limited to this. His breakthrough did not stop and continued. He had only completed the sublimation of the time period that he already occupied, and it was only a preparation to return to the time period that he did not exist yet. After the extremely sublimated ball of light illuminated the time period that Kui Heng had already occupied, it did not stop spreading. Instead, it continued to shine its light towards the upper reaches of the river of time. It landed at the time when Kui Heng walked out of the beginner's space 400 years ago and 1,100 years ago. Dao Hengzi, who had already unified the 700-year time period, immediately sensed something. Whether it was the Dao Hengzi who was imparting martial arts to the founder of the Immortal Wind Monastery, the Dao Hengzi who had roamed the world for 700 years, the Dao Hengzi who had reappeared in the mortal world and established the Immortal Wind Monastery, or the other Dao Hengzis, they all smiled and looked up. Then, they took a step and entered the river of time. Countless Dao Hengzi turned into countless lights and shadows. Just like the countless Kui Heng from before, they came from the upper reaches of the river of time and fused with the current Kui Heng. This caused Kui Heng's true spirit to sublimate again. The ball of light that symbolizes his life of cultivation became even brighter and began to spread to an even more ancient past. The brightness of the ball of light was actually equivalent to the strength of Kui Heng's cultivation realm. The place where the light shone was actually the timeline he could return to. In other words, the stronger his cultivation realm was, the further he could extend into the river of time, and the more ancient the time period he could reach. Through occupying the ancient time period, he could sublimate his cultivation realm, bringing him closer to the level of being omnipotent. One day, when Kui Heng became powerful to a certain extent, he would also become an extremely ancient existence. At the same time, because of his ancientness, he would also become an extremely powerful existence. Immortal cultivators who had reached the late-stage void return realm were like this. The stronger they were, the more ancient they would be. At the same time, the more ancient they were, the stronger they would be. Kui Heng quickly realized that he had occupied a new timeline, an even older past. Moreover, it was 2,000 years ago. It was a time period where he had not formed a spatial Dao mark. This was not a timeline that he had taken the initiative to occupy, but a past self that was naturally produced by relying on his great Dao laws to illuminate the upper reaches of the river of time. At the same time that this new timeline was occupied, his fake selves on the spacetime scale were quickly born and he began to complete the unification of time and space at an extremely fast speed. At this moment, Kui Heng finally felt the power that was pulling his true spirit into the river of time disappear. His true spirit had obtained an unprecedented sense of lightness. When it looked down at the chaos sea and the river of time again, the feeling of falling into the sea of bitterness and everything ending had already faded a lot. So this is the late-stage return to Void Realm. Kui Heng sighed in his heart and carefully experienced the special characteristics and power of this realm again. The power of my dharmic powers should already be comparable to the immortal ancestors. Moreover, I will naturally occupy timelines of even more ancient periods. While occupying the timeline, fake selves will also be born. As long as I can go back to the day the immortal ancestors were born, my dharmic powers will definitely surpass any immortal ancestor. There's no doubt about that. At the same time, my Tao and my Dharma would have already been reflected in the various timelines. The boundless chaos universe and the primordial world will be affected by the great Tao laws that I created. This also means that unless someone destroys the boundless chaos sea and the primordial world in the timelines that I occupy and return everything to the state of void formed by the beginning and the end, they can't kill me. Next, my cultivation direction is to occupy as much of the past as possible. Although new past selves will naturally appear, the process of naturally spreading the timeline is too slow. I still have to head to the past time periods to form a Tao mark myself. At this moment, his essence had increased, and his realm had broken through. He was already standing at the late-stage return to void realm and understood his next cultivation direction. However, the turmoil caused by his breakthrough had just begun. After stepping into the return to void realm, Kui Heng's cultivation phenomenon was focused on the time spectrum and almost did not affect the physical realm. Therefore, when he broke through to the mid-stage return to void realm, there was no phenomenon of him breaking through in the boundless chaos universe or the primordial world, so it did not attract much attention. However, it was completely different this time. The light of the great Tao ball of light not only shone on the time spectrum, but also affected the physical world. The moment Kui Heng began to step into the late-stage return to void realm, the entire chaos sea and the primordial world shook. Countless experts were also alerted. After all, the various great Tao laws and natural laws that were born out of thin air under the influence of the great Tao light ball had spread throughout many spacetime dimensions. Countless phenomena were born and spread throughout the past and present. With such a huge change, those quasi-immortal emperors and immortal emperors naturally sensed it. Even the immortal ancestors in the ninth heaven and the heaven-earth saints in the chaos heaven were alarmed by this huge spatial change. They had no choice but to interrupt their meetings and return to the primordial world and the chaos sea respectively. One of the immortal ancestors had just left the ninth heaven when he immediately sensed Kui Heng's aura. Ancient memories from a long time ago instantly surfaced in his heart. "It's you." An angry shout seemed to have pierced through the ages. "So it was you who attained the Tao at this moment." Die. This person was the immortal ancestor who had crossed space and time when Kui Heng went back in time to investigate the source of the Gate Master Immortal Emperor, forcing Kui Heng to enter the Grotto Heaven to escape. He seemed to have an extraordinary hatred for Kui Heng. His burning anger had spread from the beginning of the immortal ancestor's birth to now. This immortal ancestor attacked with hatred without holding back. In an instant, the power of the primordial world, past and present, was mobilized and directly pulled out of its original spacetime by this immortal ancestor, locking onto all the timelines Kui Heng had occupied in the past. Whether it was his past body that had just stepped into this world, Dao Hengzi, who had created the immortal wind monastery, or Kui Heng, who had walked out of the beginner's space for thousands of years, they all had to withstand the attack of the primordial whirl. As for Kui Heng, who was in the present timeline, he had been locked onto by this immortal ancestor who personally came over to kill him. At this moment, Kui Heng had just broken through to the late-stage return to Void Realm and was suddenly attacked by such an attack that covered the entire timeline. He could not help but be angry. After sensing the aura of this immortal ancestor, his gaze immediately became even colder as he shouted coldly, "It was you last time. It's you again this time. You have a death wish." 745 Go back 10,000 years from now, there will be no more of you. 745 Go back 10,000 years from now, there will be no more of you. A battle at the immortal ancestor level was about to begin. This instantly alarmed the living beings in the primordial world and the boundless chaos universe. Many immortal emperors and quasi-immortal emperors looked up. An unprecedented turbulence appeared in the river of time, and huge waves surged like a tsunami. Countless tributaries of time were split apart and moved forward from the current time point. The space-time of the past thousands of years had become chaotic. All kinds of matter and time seemed to have twisted into a mess, chaotic and unclear. At this moment, even experts at the peak heavenless realm or the Taisu realm had lost the ability to look back in time. They did not even dare to touch the power of time. A battle at the immortal ancestor level was a battle on the time spectrum. It affected the current disputes by changing the past, affecting the river of time the entire time. If they rashly interfered at this time, it was very likely that they would be affected. To any living being below the immortal ancestor realm, this was an unbearable power. At best, it would cause their past fate to change. Perhaps they would instantly fall from a perfected immortal emperor to an ordinary mortal. At worst, it was even possible that their past existence would be completely erased, causing their current self to disappear. As for the immortal ancestors and the heaven-earth saints who had just walked out of the ninth heaven or the chaos heaven, they were a little surprised and very puzzled. Who was this person who had suddenly attained the Tao? The nature of his power seemed to be very strange. He clearly had an aura that was comparable to the immortal ancestors, but it was not any of the three divine powers of heaven, earth, and man. What was going on? Could there be someone who could reach this level without relying on the power of the three supreme gods of heaven, earth, and man? This was impossible. Whether it was the immortal ancestors of the primordial world or the heaven-earth saints of the boundless chaos sea, they could not understand this situation. In their understanding, there was only one path to surpass the perfected immortal emperor realm and become an immortal ancestor. That was to grasp the power left behind by the three supreme gods. This was also the only way for a life form born here to approach the level of the supreme gods. There was definitely no other path. But what was wrong with this person? The aura of power on this person possessed the aura of both the primordial world and the boundless chaos universe. They had never seen such a situation. In addition, this person had an indescribable unfamiliar aura, as if it was the source of all Tao and Dharma. This was even more unbelievable. The legends of the beginning and end had been circulating in the primordial world and the chaos sea for countless years. They were the source and end of everything. A living being who had not even received the gift of the three supreme gods actually possessed such a brilliant aura. This was too unbelievable. If they hadn't seen it with their own eyes, no one would have believed that such a living being existed in the world. One of the immortal ancestors stared at Kui Heng, who was standing in the chaos sea, and frowned. This person's condition is really strange. I can't even see through him. I'm afraid he's no weaker than us in terms of strength. It's just that he's not as ancient as us. This person is indeed extraordinary and can't be underestimated. Another immortal ancestor nodded, but he said in confusion, I wonder why he's so angry when he sees him. Do they have a grudge? He has seen more than us on the time spectrum. Perhaps this person has done something at some point, an immortal ancestor said in a low voice. Since he attacked, he must have his reasons. Let's wait and see. All right. The immortal ancestor who was the first to speak nodded and said, although this person's strength is not weak, he's not as ancient as us. At this level, a slightly weaker strength in the time spectrum is equivalent to the difference between heaven and earth. However, we have to be more careful. The Chaos Sea won't ignore the sudden appearance of a new cultivator. They might help. After all, the time is almost up. They need a helper. The immortal ancestors of the primordial world were very confident in the attacking immortal ancestor. The heaven-earth saints of the Chaos Sea were considering whether to help Kui Heng. After all, in their opinion, Kui Heng had only occupied the timeline of the past few thousand years. It was too short. Even if he was incomparably powerful in this thousands of years of timeline, it was impossible for him to defeat the immortal ancestor who had already occupied a long time period. At the level of the immortal ancestors, a moment of strength was meaningless. Only how much timeline one occupied was the true difference in strength. As long as the immortal ancestor set up various arrangements in the upper reaches of the river of time, he could control the lives downstream without any worries. Under normal circumstances, in a battle on the level of time, living beings downstream would directly lose any chance to attack. Basically, they would be suppressed from the beginning and have no room to resist. The time Kui Heng could return to in the past was less than thousands of years at most. This was too far from the past that the immortal ancestor could return to. In the eyes of the immortal ancestors and the heaven-earth saints, it was impossible for Kui Heng to be a match for the immortal ancestor. It was very likely that he would die on the spot as soon as he attained the Tao. "We should help," a heaven-earth saint said in a low voice. Although this person's method of attaining the Tao is a little strange, there's no doubt that his enemies with the immortal ancestors. An enemy of the immortal ancestors might become our ally. If we can rope him in, we can effectively increase our strength and seek more opportunities before the arrival of that time. Yes, that's right. A Heaven's Will expert who had grasped the power of heaven-heart phenomenon nodded in agreement. This is also our last chance. Let's do it. The other heaven-earth saints nodded as well. Their gazes focused on Kui Heng, ready to help at any time. Whether it was the experts who had grasped the power left behind by the supreme gods of heaven and earth through their own cultivation or the Heaven's Wills who had grasped the power of heaven-heart phenomenon, they could actually be collectively referred to as heaven-earth saints. 746 Go back 10,000 years from now, there will be no traces of you. 2. 746 Go back 10,000 years from now, there will be no traces of you. 2. However, the nature of their power was slightly different. The former grasped a portion of the power left behind by the supreme god of heaven and a portion of the supreme god of earth, while the latter grasped a large amount of the power left behind by the supreme god of heaven, but the strength of the two was the same. "It's time, attack!" a heaven-earth saint realm expert shouted. Immortal ancestor Zhongmu has already occupied the past timeline that contained the existence of this person and even drawn the power of the primordial world in the past spacetime. "It'll be too late if we don't attack now." Everyone nodded and prepared to join forces to stop immortal ancestor Zhongmu's attack on Kui Heng. The reason why they had to join forces was because they knew that as long as they attacked, the other 5 immortal ancestors of the primordial world would not sit back and do nothing. They would definitely attack too. However, there were a total of 7 heaven-earth saints. Now, there were only 5 immortal ancestors who could fight. The advantage was on their side. As long as nothing unexpected happened, they could still have the upper hand. As expected, just as the group of heaven-earth saints mobilized the power of the Chaos Sea in the timeline to collide with the power of the primordial world mobilized by immortal ancestor Zhongmu, the group of immortal ancestors also moved. "I knew you were going to stir up trouble." One of the immortal ancestors rushed forward and emitted endless light. He shouted sternly, "Retreat quickly, or this will be your last tribulation." In addition, the other immortal ancestors followed closely behind. Their figures instantly spread from the present to the past, like ancient snakes lying dormant on the river of time, quickly swimming from the present to the past. At the same time, the primordial world rumbled and trembled. The power of the layers of space and time in the past was mobilized again to resist the power of the group of heaven-earth saints. This caused the space-time from the birth of the immortal ancestors to tremble violently. In the river of time, tributaries were born one after another, wanting to spread history in an unknown direction. However, they were disturbed by the lights and returned to their original trajectory. The river of time that had just returned to the right track was stimulated by the power of the endless Chaos Sea and split into more tributaries. However, it was quickly gathered back by the power of the primordial world. During this process, the fates of countless lives, universes, worlds, and civilizations were changed, restored, and then changed again. This cycle seemed to be endless. Just like that, the group of immortal ancestors and the heaven-earth saint realm experts were in a deadlock. They were unable to do anything to each other, let alone affect the battle between Kui Heng and immortal ancestor Zhongmu. Immortal ancestor Zhongmu also noticed the situation and laughed heartily. "Ha ha ha, no one can help you now. Past or present, no one can save you now. Die." He seemed to have a deep hatred for Kui Heng. When he attacked, his mental state seemed a little crazy. At this moment, the past body of immortal ancestor Zhongmu had already appeared in the timeline of all of Kui Heng's existence and began to attack the past Kui Heng. Die. 7,352 years ago, on Daoju Star. Kui Heng, who had just reached the grand completion Golden Core realm, received the notice that the novice benefits had expired. He left the beginner's space naked and appeared in a forest filled with trees. Fortunately, the gigantic trees towering into the sky had blocked out the sunlight. There was no one around. That's too ridiculous. It didn't even leave me some clothes. Kui Heng complained helplessly. Fortunately, he had already attained the grand completion stage of the Golden Core realm. With a thought, he used his dharmic powers to condense a new set of clothes for himself. After complaining, he smiled again. This is interesting. Letting me descend into this world naked can be considered as the start of a new life. Then, he wanted to investigate his surroundings. The beginner's space was wandering in the spatial rift, and he did not know what world he had arrived in. But at this moment, a power that far exceeded Kui Heng's understanding suddenly descended from an endless height. If this power really descended, the entire Daoju star would instantly turn into nothingness. Even the universe where this planet was located would turn into chaotic dust and be completely destroyed. However, at the same time that this power descended, realization appeared in Kui Heng's eyes. The aura on his body suddenly changed and he became a late-stage return to Void Cultivator. You thought that the stalemate between those immortal ancestors and the Heaven-Earth Saints means that I'm trapped in here with you? Kui Heng sneered as he looked up. At the same time, he flipped his palm and slapped upwards. Immeasurable dharmic powers erupted, directly destroying the power that was about to descend. The truth is that you are trapped in here with me. Before his words landed, the Chaos Sea and the primordial world were in an unprecedented turmoil. Countless great Tao laws trembled, as if some law of the same level as them had been born and was squeezing in. This was actually the power displayed by Kui Heng's dharmic powers. It was already far above the power of any immortal ancestor. If more immortal ancestors joined forces, they might be able to resist him, but if it was just one immortal ancestor, he had no chance of winning. Immortal ancestor Zhongmu was instantly locked onto by Kui Heng. Then, he felt the unparalleled power of the great Tao laws envelop him and begin to destroy his body and soul. Immortal ancestor Zhongmu wanted to struggle and counterattack, but he realized that he could not do anything at all. Kui Heng's dharmic powers were too powerful at this time. He actually suppressed him in all aspects, leaving him no room to resist. Going back 10,000 years from now, there will no longer be a trace of you. Kui Heng's voice echoed in the river of time, piercing through the past and present. This is impossible. Immortal ancestor Zhongmu roared in extreme unwillingness. But this was meaningless. He could only watch helplessly as the traces of his existence in this time period were erased and finally disappeared, no longer existing. Such a situation happened in the entire timeline occupied by Kui Heng. Every time period that he occupied was attacked by immortal ancestor Zhongmu, but none of them succeeded. They were all killed by him. After Kui Heng broke through to the late-stage return to Void Realm, as long as he occupied a time period, his body in that time period would have the same power as his present body. There was no moment of weakness at all. Moreover, after stepping into the late-stage return to Void Realm, the essence of his life had increased. The past and present were unified, and the influence of the great Tao Lightball had spread throughout the boundless sea of chaos, the universe, and the primordial world. Therefore, even though Kui Heng was not as ancient as the immortal ancestors, his dharmic powers were extremely powerful. It was almost equivalent to mobilizing the power of the Chaos Sea and the primordial world at the same time. This also meant that in the timeline that he had already occupied, no single immortal ancestor or Heaven-Earth Saint was his match. Immortal ancestor Zhongmu could make a series of preparations in the ancient timeline that Kui Heng had yet to occupy and influence the future Kui Heng. However, in the face of such a huge difference in strength, all preparation became meaningless. In an instant, immortal ancestor Zhongmu was killed in the timeline that Kui Heng occupied. From 2,800 years before Kui Heng transmigrated to this world, which was 10,452 years ago until now, there were no longer any traces of immortal ancestor Zhongmu. Immortal ancestor Zhongmu had stopped existing 10,452 years ago. Hence, immortal ancestor Zhongmu directly disappeared. All aura and traces of him disappeared completely. At the same time, new memories appeared in the minds of the remaining immortal ancestors, heaven-earth saints, and perfected immortal emperors. 10,452 years ago, immortal ancestor Zongmu was killed by a mysterious expert. This sudden change stunned the immortal ancestors and the heaven-earth saints who were confronting each other. Many perfected immortal emperors were even more dumbfounded, almost unable to believe their memories. What was going on? What had just happened? 747 Light of Gifts left behind by the Supreme God of Man. 747 Light of Gifts left behind by the Supreme God of Man. An immortal ancestor had fallen? He'd fallen so easily. Those who could sense the sudden change in history in the past all felt their minds rumble. They were incomparably shocked, as if they were dreaming. This was an immortal ancestor. He had obtained one of the 12 divine powers left behind by the Supreme God of Man in the past and was even the strongest expert who had once assisted the Supreme God of Man to expel the heaven-earth saints from the primordial world. Ever since the divine Tao was transformed, the 9 immortal ancestors were supreme existences. At one time, they were thought to be eternal experts who existed endlessly with time. Even though the heaven-earth saints born in the boundless chaos sea could rely on the power left behind by the divine Tao transformation of the supreme gods of heaven and earth to return to the timeline of the beginning of the supreme gods of heaven and earth divine Tao transformation and possess power that was comparable to the immortal ancestors, it did not shake their status. That was because even the heaven-earth saints could only compare to the immortal ancestors in strength. They would not really surpass the latter, let alone be capable of completely killing one. Although in the past 19 chaotic tribulations, 2 immortal ancestors had died and 1 had disappeared, these were all the results of a group of heaven-earth saints and immortal ancestors playing for countless years. It was the immortal ancestors who were at a disadvantage in terms of their tactical calculations, not that they were weak. But what had just happened? A single person, just a single person, had killed an immortal ancestor? Even if he only fixed the time of this immortal ancestor's death to 10,000 years ago, it was too exaggerated. This was a single person. How could one person do such a thing? Unbelievable. Even the heaven-earth saints who wanted to help Kui Heng were stunned. They did not expect Kui Heng to have the strength to kill immortal ancestor Zongmu. This was too terrifying. How could such a powerful existence appear out of thin air? Who exactly was he? Where did he come from? While the group of heaven-earth saints was puzzled, the 5 immortal ancestors had already returned to their senses. After confirming that immortal ancestor Zongmu had really been killed more than 10,000 years ago, they were immediately furious. The anger in their hearts was almost condensed into substance. This caused the laws of the entire primordial world to become erratic and chaotic. Many living beings could not withstand it at all and were destroyed on the spot. In just a short moment, more than 70% of the living beings in the primordial world perished. Moreover, these living beings did not know why such a thing happened at all. They could not figure out why the 5 immortal ancestors were suddenly so furious. After all, most living beings could not sense the changes in time. Therefore, in their understanding, immortal ancestor Zongmu had already died more than 10,000 years ago. If the 5 immortal ancestors were to be angry, they should have vented their anger at that time. Why did it drag on until now? However, the remaining 5 immortal ancestors would not pay attention to the living beings who died because of this. They were all focused on saving immortal ancestor Zongmu. While they were furious, their bodies had already gone to attack Kui Heng 10,452 years ago. Immortal ancestor Zongmu had only been killed 10,452 years ago. He had not been erased from the river of time. He was still alive in the past spacetime, but his existence had only stopped in this 10,000 years. This situation was still salvageable. As long as they stopped Kui Heng from killing immortal ancestor Zongmu in the timeline he occupied, they could change the past and reverse the current situation, allowing immortal ancestor Zongmu to live. However, at the same time that the 5 immortal ancestors attacked the past Kui Heng, the 7 heaven-earth saints also took action. Their past bodies also descended one after another and blocked in front of the 5 immortal ancestors to stop their attack on Kui Heng. This way, Kui Heng would not be affected in that timeline. He could continue killing immortal ancestor Zhongmu uninterrupted. In response to this situation, the Heaven-Earth Saints of the Chaos Sea were very experienced and were completely familiar with it. This was because the 2 immortal ancestors who had died in the Chaos Calamity and the missing immortal ancestor were also in a temporary death state similar to this situation. It was not an eternal death. In the endless years before this, the immortal ancestors had worked hard countless times to change the past history and let the 3 immortal ancestors recover to their original state. However, every time they tried and worked hard, they were stopped by a group of Heaven-Earth Saints from the Chaos Sea. Actually, the history that people were familiar with now was essentially the manifestation of the results of the past 19 Chaos Calamities. The reason why the current history was that 2 immortal ancestors had died in the 4th and 11th Chaos Calamity one after another, and one had been injured by the Tao in the 16th Chaos Calamity and disappeared, was because in these 3 Chaos Calamities, the few immortal ancestors of the primordial world had fallen into a disadvantage in the spacetime game. Of course, because the 3 immortal ancestors had not been erased of all their traces in the timeline, they had even existed in the past for a period of time. Therefore, as long as these immortal ancestors of the primordial world gained the upper hand in the game of time, history can be easily reconstructed. At that time, the 2 dead immortal ancestors would return, the heavily injured and missing immortal ancestor would appear again, and a new version of history would be born. As for the living beings below the perfected immortal emperor realm, they would think that history had always been like this. In their understanding, the 9 immortal ancestors had always been in a normal state and they would not notice any historical changes on the time spectrum at all. However, the 3 immortal ancestors had been in an abnormal state for more than 100 years. They had been preparing for their rescue plan for a long time and were not in a hurry. They could completely wait for the Chaos Calamity to erupt before attacking. However, the situation with immortal ancestor Zhongmu was different. This immortal ancestor had benefited from the nature of the divine power left behind by the supreme god of man, and he was extremely sensitive to the changes in time. Not only did he play an important part in the plan of rescuing the 3 immortal ancestors, but he also played an extremely important role in the previous Chaos Calamities. "748 Light of Gifts left behind by the Supreme God of Man, 2. 748 Light of Gifts left behind by the Supreme God of Man, 2. Without immortal ancestor Zhongmu, the rescue plan for the 3 immortal ancestors would be filled with loopholes, and the situation on the primordial world side would become even more difficult in the upcoming Chaos Calamity. Therefore, the remaining 5 immortal ancestors would definitely not allow immortal ancestor Zhongmu to die just like that. Naturally, they had to do their best to save him. To the Heaven-Earth Saints of the Chaos Sea, this was a rare opportunity. Naturally, they could not let the other party succeed. The more anxious the 5 immortal ancestors were to save immortal ancestor Zhongmu, the stronger their desire to stop them. Just as the power of the 5 immortal ancestors surged towards Kui Heng from 10,000 years ago, the power of a group of Heaven-Earth Saints had also descended to that time to block the power of the 5 immortal ancestors. Such a huge collision of power directly caused the time period to fall into an extremely terrifying state. Whether it was the boundless chaos universe or the primordial world, all the great Tao laws had fallen into a state of collapse, as if everything was about to sink and perish. In the endless chaos sea, universes shattered like bubbles, and countless lives and civilizations disappeared. The situation in the primordial world was also extremely bad. The vast world was filled with the power of destruction, and living beings below the immortal king realm died in droves. Even immortal king experts would die in an instant as long as they accidentally approached the power of the great Tao laws. Only quasi-immortal emperors and immortal emperors could barely survive such a terrifying calamity. This was only the first round of confrontation between the group of Heaven-Earth Saints and the 5 immortal ancestors, but it had already caused extremely huge damage to the Chaos Sea and the primordial world. At the same time, countless living beings also instantly died. All kinds of living beings were also born. Many inheritances became completely different from before, and some civilizations even developed in the opposite direction. That was because history had changed 10,000 years ago. The apocalyptic Great Destruction had directly reshaped history, causing most things at the present time to be different from before. All of this was not sensed by living beings below the perfected immortal emperor realm. Just like how immortal ancestor Zhongmu died 10,000 years ago, in their understanding, the Great Destruction had always existed and had never changed. Only those perfected immortal emperors who could sense the changes in history revealed sorrowful expressions, and their eyes flickered with dense despair and pain. To these perfected immortal emperors, they could sense the changes in the history of time, but they had no ability to change it. They could only feel that they were as small as ants, like illusions. It was too painful. However, a confrontation at the immortal ancestor level would never care about the feelings of other living beings. Just as the situation had stabilized, there was another earth-shattering change. At this moment, life, civilization, and the world had all been updated again, and they were different from before. That was because the confrontation between the immortal ancestors and the Heaven-Earth Saints 10,000 years ago had changed again. After all, the Heaven-Earth Saints had the advantage in numbers and quickly obtained an advantage. Hence, they changed the situation at this time and reshaped history. Naturally, the present was changed again. However, the 5 immortal ancestors had deep foundations after all. Even though they were at a disadvantage and the situation was urgent, they quickly counterattacked, causing a drastic change in the present. In short, during the confrontation between this group of Heaven-Earth Saints and the immortal ancestors, the present timeline and the time period 10,452 years before were changed drastically. Countless lives, countless civilizations, countless worlds, and so on seemed to be illusions that could be modified, erased, and reconstructed at will. The final outcome of this change was never determined. It was only the outcome of the final game between the immortal ancestors and the Heaven-Earth Saints. Of course, there was also Kui Heng, the uncertain factor. At this time 10,452 years ago, Kui Heng was at the core of the battle between the 5 immortal ancestors and a group of Heaven-Earth Saints. The power of both sides restrained each other and could not affect him at all. This allowed him to kill immortal ancestor Zhongmu very smoothly without any obstruction. Boom! In this spacetime dimension more than 10,000 years ago, a monstrous rain of blood suddenly fell from the sky of the primordial world. A huge hole seemed to have broken through the sky, and blood rained down like a waterfall. At the same time, an extremely sorrowful aura filled the world, as if the entire primordial world was crying. All the living beings felt an inexplicable pain in their eyes, and blood tears subconsciously flowed down. Such a phenomenon had appeared more than 100 years ago. Some ancient existences looked at the sky in a daze, their bodies trembling, their hearts filled with fear. An immortal ancestor has fallen. An immortal ancestor has fallen. What's going on? The chaos calamity hasn't begun yet. Why did an immortal ancestor die? It's too sudden. What happened? Which immortal ancestor died? Many immortal kings, quasi-immortal emperors, and immortal emperors below the perfection realm were all shocked. They almost could not believe their eyes and could not understand how such a thing could suddenly happen. Only the perfected immortal emperors smiled bitterly. They all understood that this was just another part of the high-level game. They could only watch from the sidelines. In any case, they could not do anything. At this moment, under Kui Heng's absolute power, immortal ancestor Zhongmu's body and soul had already been destroyed. Even the most fundamental wisp of true spirit had been destroyed by his dharmic powers. At this moment, he realized that the essence of an immortal ancestor's true spirit was actually inferior to a peak soul formation cultivator. His characteristics of being undying and indestructible were extremely weak. The reason why the immortal ancestors were so powerful was all because of the wisp of dazzling light in their bodies. The moment Kui Heng completely destroyed immortal ancestor Zhongmu, an extremely bright and resplendent ball of light that seemed to contain the ultimate mysteries of the Tao of life suddenly appeared from his destroyed true spirit. As soon as this ball of light appeared, It triggered the hearts of all the living beings in the primordial world and the boundless chaos universe. It was as if they were being summoned by the source of life at the beginning of life and could not help but want to approach this ball of light. Even the heaven-earth saints and immortal ancestors, who were confronting each other, were attracted by the appearance of this strange light. They actually stopped what they were doing and stared at it. It's the inheritance of the supreme God of man. It actually didn't scatter on its own this time. No one can snatch it away. Hurry up and attack. Hand over the divine inheritance of the supreme God of man. The 5 immortal ancestors rushed towards Kui Heng almost at the same time, wanting to snatch the strange light. The group of heaven-earth saints also moved, but they did not snatch the ball of light. Instead, they continued to stop the 5 immortal ancestors from reaching the ball of light. At this moment, Kui Heng also knew what this was. This was clearly one of the 12 portions of the power left behind by the supreme God of man, a portion obtained by immortal ancestor Zhongmu. Now that immortal ancestor Zhongmu had been destroyed, this power had appeared in front of him. Kui Heng's gaze landed on this ball of light. His eyes narrowed slightly as he thought to himself, this contains the divine origin power of the supreme God of man. It's also one of the energies closest to the source of this world. 749 The Fifth Guest. 749 The Fifth Guest. The 2 supreme existences, beginning and end, had stopped appearing since the birth of the heaven, earth, and man supreme gods. The time gap was too long ago. Even immortal ancestor-level experts knew very little about these 2 existences. It was almost as if they only knew of their existence. To most living beings, be it the origin of life, matter, or laws, the source that they could be traced back to was the 3 supreme gods of heaven, earth, and man. The source of life was the divine nature of the supreme God of man, the source of matter was the divine nature of the supreme God of earth, and the source of laws was the divine nature of the supreme God of heaven. These 3 existences almost symbolized the source of everything in the world. That was because as long as one grasped the power left behind by the 3 supreme gods, they could obtain a supreme power close to the origin of everything and have powerful strength that other living beings could not compare to. In other words, the power of the immortal ancestors or heaven-earth saints. It could be said to be a great fortune and an extremely generous gift. Now, this gift was placed in front of Kui Heng. However, to Kui Heng, the use of this gift was not to increase his dharmic powers, but to help him obtain more understanding of the deeper mysteries of this world. As long as the knowledge was closer to omnipotence, he would also be closer to being omnipotent. His strength would naturally increase, and then he could return to an even more ancient timeline and occupy it. This was the cultivation direction of a late-stage return to Void Cultivator. In short, this gift left behind by the supreme God of man was extremely important to Kui Heng. It was naturally impossible for the immortal ancestors to take it back. Therefore, when the 5 immortal ancestors tried their best to attack Kui Heng and snatch this gift left behind by the supreme God of man, Kui Heng decisively attacked. Counterattack. A huge amount of dharmic power that was enough to instantly sweep through the entire boundless chaos universe and the primordial world erupted. Moreover, it was not purely a head-on collision of strength, but the manifestation of spells. Numerous auspicious cloud mandates appeared out of thin air above the heads of the 5 immortal ancestors. Every auspicious cloud mandate condensed into extremely powerful spells. Immortal Binding Rope, Yin-Yang Seal, Time Saber, Dao Life Sword. Although in theory, Kui Heng did not have the time to cultivate these spells to the late-stage Void Return realm, the flow of time was meaningless to Kui Heng right now. The moment he stepped into the late-stage Return to Void realm, countless fake selves opened up a separate time-space to control the flow of time and cultivate these spells. Compared to the superficial flow of time, the moment Kui Heng broke through to the late-stage Return to Void realm, he let these spells sublimate with him, and their power and utility naturally increased. Facing these Dharma spells that had been cultivated to the late-stage Return to Void realm, the 5 immortal ancestors who were preparing to snatch the divine inheritance from Kui Heng's hands suddenly felt a sense of danger. At this moment, most of the power of the 5 immortal ancestors were used to resist the group of heaven-earth saints. They could only divert a small portion of their strength to attack Kui Heng. Such an attack was naturally not powerful. Under the sharpness of the Tao life sword, the attacks launched by the 5 immortal ancestors were all destroyed in an instant. The Tao life sword that seemed to contain the power to split the world slashed towards them. At the same time, 5 immortal binding ropes descended from the clouds. An extremely powerful imprisonment power landed on the 5 immortal ancestors, causing their movements to be sluggish. In addition, there was also the power of death and nirvana contained in the yin-yang seal. A pitch-black light enveloped the 5 immortal ancestors and quickly drained their vitality. After the time saber reached the late-stage return to Void Realm, it had already undergone a qualitative change. Other than the effect of reducing one's lifespan, there was another magical effect, which was to weaken the target in the past timeline. With this slash, the power of the 5 immortal ancestors was reduced by 0.0001%. 0.0001% might not seem like much, but in a battle at the level of the immortal ancestor, even if it was only a 0.00000001% decrease in strength, it might cause a completely different outcome. Not to mention 0.0001%. The moment the time saber descended, the effects of the immortal binding rope, Tao life sword, and yin-yang seal increased greatly. The 5 immortal ancestors could not even dodge and were directly slashed by the Tao life sword. Clang, clang, clang. The sword cry seemed to have pierced through space and time, slashing from the past to the present. The 5 immortal ancestors' bodies all left an indelible sword mark. The same sword marks had appeared on the 5 immortal ancestors' bodies in the present. There were no signs of weakening, and they still looked as if they had just been slashed. The yin-yang seal transformed into a pitch-black treasure mirror that floated above the 5 immortal ancestors' bodies. Black light descended, causing wisps of death chi to begin to emit from their bodies. Such a situation was simply the best time for the group of Heaven-Earth Saints to attack. They naturally would not let it go. They immediately mobilized the power of the Chaos Sea to attack the 5 immortal ancestors. But just as Kui Hang, the immortal ancestors, and the Heaven-Earth Saints were attacking, the ball of inheritance power left behind by the Supreme God of Man suddenly moved, as if it had been summoned by some strange power. It actually left this time period and flew out of the universe, entering the river of time. This sudden change immediately shocked the 5 immortal ancestors. They seemed to have thought of something and revealed a flustered expression. He actually succeeded. Chase after it. We can't let him succeed. Don't worry about this place. Let's chase after it. The 5 immortal ancestors clearly knew the origin of the strange power left behind by the Supreme God of Man, and it was most likely a source that was very disadvantageous to them. Therefore, after discovering that the inheritance left behind by the Supreme God of Man had escaped, they did not hesitate to activate the source of power in their bodies, which was the aura of power left behind by the Supreme God of Man. In an instant, a terrifying aura that completely exceeded the level of the immortal ancestors erupted from their bodies. They actually broke free from Kui Heng's shackles and attacks on them, and they also broke free from the attacks of the Heaven-Earth Saints and chased into the river of time. "750 The Fifth Guest, 2. 750 The Fifth Guest, 2. Kui Heng was a little surprised by this sudden situation, but he did not continue to chase after the 5 immortal ancestors. After all, he had just broken through to the late-stage return to Void Realm. He could still kill one immortal ancestor, but it was not possible to kill 5 immortal ancestors at the same time. The reason why he could suppress the 5 immortal ancestors alone just now was because of the restraint of the group of Heaven-Earth Saints. Of course, giving up on chasing after the 5 immortal ancestors did not mean giving up on the power left behind by the Supreme God of Man. Almost at the same time that the 5 immortal ancestors chased into the river of time, Kui Heng also chased after them. Moreover, his speed was even faster, directly surpassing the 5 immortal ancestors and stepping on the river of time. The group of Heaven-Earth Saints were naturally unwilling to fall behind and followed. However, they were weaker than the immortal ancestor in terms of their abilities in the time spectrum, so it was naturally difficult for them to catch up. However, Not being able to catch up did not mean that there was no way to set up obstacles. After this group of heaven-earth saints realized that they could not catch up to the 5 immortal ancestors, they changed their strategy and began to mobilize the power of the Chaos Sea, forming all kinds of imprisonment methods that were applied to the 5 immortal ancestors to slow him down. This way, Kui Heng had no obstacles by his side and could easily chase after the divine inheritance of the supreme god of man that was summoned by the strange power. However, the essence of this inheritance left behind by the supreme god of man was extremely high, and it moved extremely quickly in the river of time. Even immortal ancestor-level experts were at most on par with it. Under such circumstances, it was impossible to chase after it. Fortunately, the essence of life of a late-stage return to void cultivator had already been sublimated to the extreme. Standing on the river of time, his speed naturally surpassed that of the immortal ancestors. Therefore, after Kui Heng stepped into the river of time, he quickly caught up to the ball of divine inheritance left behind by the supreme god of man. He was about to be able to imprison and capture it at the same time. However, at this moment, the gift left behind by the supreme god of man suddenly sank down and fell into the primordial world of this time period. Kui Heng hurriedly chased after it, but as soon as he set foot on this timeline, he sensed something in his heart. This time period is 200 years after I transmigrated. As he could not go back to the time period of 300 years when he was in the beginner's space, out of caution, he did not occupy the timeline between the 300 years and the previous 100 years. This also caused Kui Heng to not have a past body at this time and could not directly make a move in this time point. However, after stepping into the late-stage return to Void Realm, he could already descend to a certain known point in the past. It was not difficult. It was just that in order to avoid causing some unknown changes, he did not do this. Although I can't go back to the time when I was in the beginner's space, I can occupy the timeline outside the beginner's space. Even if I don't occupy it, I can still descend personally to investigate. Kui Heng pondered for a moment and thought to himself, in my future cultivation, I'll definitely explore and occupy this timeline. It's impossible for me to avoid it forever, so I'll take this opportunity to descend to this time point and try to explore. Even if there's really a problem, I can use the characteristics of my fake selves to resolve it. There won't be much trouble. Thinking of this, Kui Heng no longer hesitated. He directly sent down an incarnation and appeared in the primordial world of this time point. At the same time, he locked onto the place where the aura left behind by the supreme god of man had disappeared. At this moment, the inheritance left behind by the supreme god of man was no longer escaping. Even its aura had disappeared, as if it had already arrived at the source of the summoning power and found its final owner before completely hiding. Who exactly is it that actually has the ability to summon the divine inheritance of the supreme god of man in front of the 5 immortal ancestors? Kui Heng was also very puzzled. However, the source of that summoning power seemed to be very mysterious. With his current divine sense, he could only barely sense the blurry aura characteristics through the river of time. Now that he had personally descended to this time point, the situation he sensed was naturally different from before. He directly saw the source of the summoning power and investigated the aura characteristics of its source. However, after Kui Heng descended, he was immediately stunned on the spot. He looked in the direction of the summoning power in shock. He did not expect this outcome. It's actually him. Zhu Xian was very excited now. He never dreamed that he would obtain such a huge opportunity in succession. 3 times. This was the 3rd time. Why are the heavens treating me so well? Zhu Xian held the strange ball of light in his hand, his heart filled with emotion. He thought to himself, what exactly is this? Not only did it allow me to have such achievements in such a short period of time, but there's actually another one. At this moment, he had already reached the peak of the Heaven Ascension realm and was only a step away from the Heavenly Dharma realm. As long as he could cross this step, he would truly step into the middle ranks of the primordial world. He would also become a moderately famous person in the area he lived in. Actually, as the lowest level ordinary person in the primordial world, he originally had no chance to have his current status and strength. All the changes came from Zhu Xian's fortuitous encounter 30 years ago. At that time, Zhu Xian was only 10 years old and his body had yet to mature. According to the cultivation system in the Endless Chaos Sea, he was only equivalent to a third realm heaven immortal. Although children of this age were still weak in the environment of the primordial world, they had already left the period where they needed to be protected and could play by themselves. 30 years ago, when Zhu Xian was playing alone at home, he suddenly fell into a strange place. That place had many strange flowers and fruits that he had never seen before. They tasted very sweet, and there was also a house with a strange shape that he had never seen before. He wanted to go in and take a look, but he was stopped by an invisible force. He could not approach at all, so he could only play outside the house. Although Zhu Xian was young at that time, he had also been taught by his parents about the dangers of the outside world. In such a situation, if he encountered an unfathomable expert, he could not anger the other party, or else he would be killed. Therefore, in that strange place, Zhu Xian had always been very obedient. At most, he would steal a few red fruits. After 7 days, he suddenly realized that a sentence had appeared in his mind. It was actually a cultivation technique that ordinary people dreamed of. It was called the Heaven and Earth Fist Scripture. Although this cultivation technique was categorized as a martial Dao and was something Zhu Xian had never heard of, in his opinion, as long as it was a cultivation technique, it was an extremely important treasure. On the 12th day, he left that strange place and returned home. Ever since then, Zhu Xian had begun to secretly cultivate the Heaven and Earth Fist Scripture, constantly increasing his strength in anticipation of becoming stronger in the future and changing the current situation of his family. Later on, as his cultivation realm increased, he gradually came into contact with the orthodox cultivation path of the primordial world, which was information about the 9 heavens realm. From that moment on, Zhu Xian tried to fuse the martial Dao he cultivated with the concepts of the 9 heavens realm and achieved quite a bit. Finally, one day, when he was 20 years old, he finally broke through the limits of an ordinary person and reached the first level of the 9 heavens realm, the heaven observation realm. It was also on that day that a meteor fell from the sky. The meteor entered the space between Zhu Xian's brows and fused with his body and soul. It became his greatest cultivation reliance for the next 20 years, and it was also the reason why his cultivation speed was so fast. Originally, he thought that he was already lucky enough. He did not expect that 20 years after obtaining that meteor, he would actually obtain another treasure with the same aura as that meteor. Zhu Xian could not help but let his imagination run wild. Could it be that I'm really a special existence and have the so-called heavenly fate? "751 A storm is coming. 751 A storm is coming." Kui Heng stood outside the manor and stared at Zhu Xian. He never expected that the person who summoned the divine power left behind by the supreme god of man was actually someone who had once entered his beginner's space. That was the 170th year after he transmigrated, and 20 years after Pei Qingshu and Li Mingqiong left the beginner's space. A little boy had accidentally entered the beginner's space. It was the 5th guest from the beginner's space after Hong Fugue, Jiang Chichi, Pei Qingshu, and Li Mingqiong. However, at that time, Kui Heng had already stepped into the Golden Core realm and had made up his mind to use the remaining 100 years to cultivate and no longer receive guests. Therefore, he did not even meet this person. He only gave the little boy a fist technique that he'd newly created and ignored him. From then on, Kui Heng had already forgotten about the little boy's existence. He did not expect to see him under such circumstances. He did not expect that the little boy was actually from the primordial world. Did the beginner's space drift as far as the primordial world? Kui Heng was extremely surprised. His current encounter was really beyond his expectations. The former little boy had already become an expert comparable to the Grand Completion Golden Core realm. He even had some characteristics similar to the nascent Soul realm. It had only been 30 years. It had to be said that his improvement was lightning fast. Of course, what surprised Kui Heng the most was that this person actually had the power of inheritance of the supreme god of man on him. Just now, he was the one who released a strange summoning power to attract the divine power dropped by immortal ancestor Zhongmu. A single person attracted 2 balls of the supreme god of man's divine power. Who exactly is he? Kui Heng frowned slightly. At the same time, his eyes lit up with a bright silver light as he began to look at this person's past experiences. Zhu Xian. His parents are ordinary people from the primordial world. They can't even come into contact with cultivation methods. It was after he cultivated the fist scripture I gave him. Kui Heng's eyes flashed with scenes of Zhu Xian's past. He saw the first ball of divine power that automatically landed on Zhu Xian's body, and he also saw that after immortal ancestor Zhongmu died, the ball of divine power was attracted by the strange power on Zhu Xian's body and crossed space and time to come here. The source of this attraction was actually the special power that Zhu Xian had cultivated after using the primordial world's essence energy and laws to cultivate the heaven and earth fist scripture. It's actually like this. Kui Heng was very surprised, but he quickly understood what was going on. The heaven and earth fist scripture was created by me after I stepped into the golden core realm. It contains more immortal cultivation concepts. Using the origin energy and laws of the primordial world to cultivate this martial technique, the power obtained has an extremely high essence. Although it's still quite a distance from the dharmic powers of an immortal cultivator, it can already be called a high-quality imitation. It's precisely this kind of high-level dharmic power that combines the concept of immortal cultivation and the characteristics of the primordial world that has a strong attraction to the power left behind by the supreme god of man. If that's the case. Thinking of this, he circulated the dharmic powers in his body and instantly created a ball of light. It was a special power that combined the characteristics of the primordial world and the dharmic powers of immortal cultivators. However, Kui Heng did not release this special power. Instead, he gathered it in his palm and did not let this special power spread. He looked at the courtyard where Zhu Xian was and suddenly smiled. Since you've returned to this point, come over. At the same time, Zhu Xian suddenly froze. Then, an enlightened expression appeared on his face. His life force also changed, and he actually reached a level similar to the immortal ancestors. Clearly, at this moment, Zhu Xian was breaking through and starting to rewind his past self to occupy the past timeline. 10,200 years later, which was the present time, Zhu Xian completely surpassed the 9 heavens realm. Through a gift left behind by the supreme god of man, he reached the level of the immortal ancestors and the heaven-earth saint realm. Although Zhu Xian had never seen Kui Heng before, he still remembered the aura in the immortal realm. At this moment, Kui Heng had revealed the aura of the immortal realm, so he naturally recognized him. Zhu Xian hurriedly walked out of the courtyard and kowtowed in front of Kui Heng. He said extremely respectfully, "Junior Zhu Xian greets immortal master." In his opinion, the starting point of the change in his fate was when he accidentally entered that immortal realm when he was young. If not for that fortuitous encounter, he would not have learned the heaven and earth fist scripture. Then, the 2 subsequent meteors would never have landed on him. There was also no need to even dream about attaining his current achievements. However, he did not expect to see the owner of the immortal realm when he went back in time. This made him overjoyed, and he naturally had to go over to pay his respects. However, Zhu Xian thought that since he had not obtained the recognition of this mysterious expert, he did not dare to call himself a disciple, nor did he dare to call Kui Heng master or teacher. He only dared to refer to himself as a junior and address Kui Heng as immortal master. "Get up." Kui Heng waved his hand gently and smiled. "I didn't expect that on a whim back then. I actually created a new immortal ancestor. Fate is really strange." "Thank you, immortal master." Zhu Xian first thanked him, then stood up and explained, "Immortal master, I'm different from the normal immortal ancestors. I didn't reach this realm by fusing with the inheritance left behind by the supreme god of man. After receiving the second inheritance left behind by the supreme god of man, I began to comprehend the mysteries of these 2 powers. Then, I discovered that the characteristics of these inheritances were extremely compatible with the power I cultivated, and my cultivation advanced by leaps and bounds. After I comprehend all the power left behind by the supreme god of man, I'll naturally reach a realm similar to the immortal ancestor realm. However, due to the limitation of the timeline I occupied, I should be inferior to the other immortal ancestors right now. The advantage is that I don't have to fuse with the power left behind by the supreme god of man to stand in this realm. 752A storm is coming, too. 752A storm is coming, too. As he spoke, he flipped his palm and took out 2 balls of light left behind by the supreme god of man. He said extremely sincerely, Immortal Master, I have no way to repay your kindness. I'm willing to offer the power left behind by these 2 balls of light to you as a token of my sincerity. These 2 balls of light were intertwined with endless power and contained the source of life and the ultimate mysteries of this world. They were treasures that anyone dreamed of. Even to Kui Heng, it was extremely useful. However, Kui Heng shook his head and said indifferently, I only gave you the heaven and earth fist scripture casually back then. I can't afford such a heavy thank you gift. This, Zhu Xian did not expect his gift of the power left behind by the supreme god of man to be rejected. On second thought, he said, then can Immortal Master let me stay by your side to cultivate? At the same time, these 2 balls of light left behind by the supreme god of man can be temporarily placed in your Dao Hall. You can comprehend them at will. Consider it my payment for taking refuge with you, Immortal Master. How about that? Refuge? Kui Heng laughed when he heard that. He understood what Zhu Xian meant. He was saying that because he had 2 portions of the power left behind by the supreme god of man, he would definitely be targeted or even besieged by the immortal ancestors. Therefore, asking to cultivate by his side could be considered a form of refuge. However, in reality, Kui Heng had long become enemies with the immortal ancestors. It was actually more dangerous to stay by his side. It was more likely that he would be besieged by the immortal ancestors. The reason why Zhu Xian said this was because he wanted to thank Kui Heng for his kindness. Since he had already said this, Kui Heng did not refuse. He nodded slightly and said, forget it, cultivate by my side in the future. Thank you, Immortal Master. Zhu Xian was overjoyed when he heard this. He knelt on the ground again and raised his hands high, handing the 2 balls of divine gifts to Kui Heng. Please keep them for the time being. All right. Kui Heng nodded and spread out his sleeve, putting away the 2 balls of divine power. At this moment, the river of time suddenly stirred up waves. A group of heaven-earth saints and 5 immortal ancestors also chased after him to this time point. An extremely terrifying power erupted in the void, causing the primordial world at this time to tremble violently. Countless living beings panicked and felt that the great chaos calamity had arrived in advance. When they arrived, they happened to see Kui Heng putting the 2 balls of divine power into his sleeve. The expressions of the 5 immortal ancestors immediately became extremely ugly, especially when they saw Zhu Xian, who had already reached the immortal ancestor realm. They were even more furious. The heaven-earth saints were overjoyed. To them, as long as the immortal ancestors could not take back the legacy of the supreme god of man, it was a great thing. Kui Heng sensed the terrifying fluctuations of power that filled the world. His gaze landed on the 5 immortal ancestors and he said indifferently, at this point, why don't you stop? Do you really want the primordial world to be destroyed from this time point? This was not an exaggeration. The primordial world was naturally very stable and its essence was extremely high. However, its foundation had long been damaged. When the supreme god of man joined forces with all sides to expel the 2 supreme gods of heaven and earth, the source of the primordial world had suffered a huge blow. Moreover, after the supreme gods of heaven and earth transformed into the endless universe of the Chaos Sea, it completely enveloped the primordial world, restricting its development and expansion. This caused the primordial world to not recover for countless years. Coupled with the disasters caused by the 19 chaos calamities, even the originally vast continent was split into 9 pieces. At this time, the primordial world was already quite dilapidated. If so many immortal ancestor-level experts and a late-stage return to void cultivator like Kui Heng erupted into battle at this moment, it was very likely that they would really shatter the primordial world. Kui Heng's words made the faces of the 5 immortal ancestors turn ashen, but they were helpless. After a moment of silence, The 5 immortal ancestors could only snort coldly. Then, they transformed into streams of light and left, disappearing without a trace. The group of Heaven-Earth saints bowed to Kui Heng to express their gratitude. This battle was a huge victory for them. After all, an immortal ancestor had died. At this moment, a Heaven-Earth saint walked forward and cupped his hands at Kui Heng. "I'm Yuan Ming. Greetings, Dao Brother Kui." Kui Heng cupped his hands and returned the greeting. He smiled and said, "Dao Brother Yuan. Previously, at the meeting in the Chaos Heaven Assembly, I heard Wei Ju talk about Dao Brother's deeds." Yuan Ming smiled and said, "Now that the storm has calmed down, I wonder if I'm lucky enough to visit Dao Brother's Dao Hall?" "All right." Kui Heng nodded slightly and said, "Dao Brother, if you're willing to come, you can come at any time. I happen to have something to ask you." "Then it's a deal." Yuan Ming laughed. In this time point, as the battle between Kui Heng, the Heaven-Earth Saints, and the immortal ancestors ended, everything returned to its previous state. The living beings who had died in the battle between the 3 sides were all revived by the group of experts, changing the fact that they were dead. This was not a resurrection. That was because in the current timeline, they had never died. Kui Heng also returned to the immortal land of the Silver Disk Star Sea. He chose an overseas island here and built a simple and ancient Daoist temple as his Dao Hall. He named it Pure Yang Palace. This did not have any special meaning. It was purely to commemorate his experience playing a large-scale martial arts online game on Earth. However, the people in this land did not know the origins of Pure Yang Palace. Many people thought that this must contain some kind of profound truth that pointed to the ultimate mystery of the end of cultivation. Even Jun Tian, who was beside Kui Heng, thought so. Therefore, after the establishment of Pure Yang Palace, what he often did was to visualize the words Pure Yang written on the Daoist temple plaque, trying to comprehend some mysterious principles from it. Zhu Xian also checked into Pure Yang Palace and stayed in a wing of the Daoist temple. He clearly possessed a deep sense of danger. After obtaining a stable environment to grow, he began to travel in time without stopping, wanting to truly possess the strength of an immortal ancestor as soon as possible. However, before that, Zhu Xian still chatted with Kui Heng about some things. He told Kui Heng about his experiences over the years, as well as his relationship with the immortal ancestors of the primordial world and the Heaven-Earth Saints of the Chaos Sea. Not long after Zhu Xian entered seclusion to cultivate, Yuan Ming sent Venerable Master Zhu to Pure Yang Palace to send a visitation card, saying that he would visit Kui Heng before 100 years. At this time period, both the primordial world and the boundless Chaos Sea had entered a very calm state. Even the river of time had become calm. However, everyone knew that this was only the calm before the storm. A storm was brewing. Kui Heng sat on a meditation cushion in the Pure Yang Palace hall. His eyes were slightly closed as he sat cross-legged. Beside him floated 2 bright balls of light. It was the power left behind by the supreme god of man. Now, he planned to investigate these 2 light balls in all aspects and strive to understand more about this secret information, so that he could achieve omnipotence. After completing his investigation of the 2 light balls, Kui Heng planned to do something else. This time, he'd successfully descended to the time when he was still in the beginner's space, giving him a thought of occupying that timeline. If he could really successfully occupy that period of time, Kui Heng could resolve a question he had always had. Where did Jiang Chichi go? At that time, he should be able to get an answer. 753 critical time points. 753 critical time points. In the Pure Yang Palace's hall, Kui Heng's perception slowly enveloped the 2 balls of divine power left behind by the supreme god of man and began to analyze and explore them in detail. One of the balls of light came from the dead immortal ancestor Zhongmu. This was very clear. The origin of the other ball was unknown. He only knew that it had crossed space and landed on Zhu Xian, but he did not know where it came from. However, Kui Heng obtained an answer after analyzing it. This outcome surprised him. It was actually the remnant energy from the creation of the 2 Gate Master Immortal Emperors. Originally, This was one of the 3 gifts that the supreme god of man wanted to leave behind for the ordinary living beings. Later on, it landed in the hands of the immortal ancestors and was used by them to carry out a series of experiments. The 2 Gate Master Immortal Emperors were only one of their creations. When Kui Heng crossed the River of Time to investigate the past of the Gate Master Immortal Emperor, he had even seen this ball of light left behind by the supreme god of man in the distant spacetime. Unexpectedly, for some reason, the immortal ancestors lost control of this ball of light, causing it to fall into Zhu Xian's hands. Although this ball of divine light had nurtured 2 Gate Master Immortal Emperors, it was not damaged. If there was an analogy, the energy drained from it was like taking out a drop of water from the ocean. Therefore, these 2 balls of light could still provide Kui Heng with extremely large amounts of information, allowing him to further understand the mysteries of this world. In addition, these 2 balls of light could also be used as road guides to return to the past. They could help Kui Heng condense a Dao mark at time points in the past where he had yet to be born, making it easier for him to occupy the past timeline. It could be said to be very useful. In the Pure Yang Palace, the 2 balls of light left behind by the supreme god of man shone brightly. Under the envelopment of Kui Heng's divine sense, the countless information contained in it surfaced, and countless unknown mysteries became known. This allowed his cultivation to rapidly increase, and his true spirit began to sublimate. He became closer and closer to being omnipotent. At the same time, Kui Heng also began to reflect the great Dao light ball he cultivated into the past and condense Dao marks according to the information he obtained from the divine power left behind by the supreme god of man. Hence, on the scale of the River of Time, one after another, Kui Heng's Dao marks were born. Right now, Kui Heng was already different from the first time he occupied the timeline through the Dao mark. After his first experience, he was already familiar with it. After condensing the Dao marks in the time points of the past, he quickly expanded his influence at those time points through these Dao marks and established his identity at that time, making the Dao marks more real. As long as his identities which were linked to the Dao marks became real, he could use time reversal to occupy that time point. Then, using this as a starting point, he could continue to connect the more distant time points and occupy a timeline. However, the identities tied to the Dao marks could not be fabricated at will. They had to be identities that matched the original history and could be linked up and unified. This was actually equivalent to Kui Heng weaving his own history in the past timeline and embedding it into existing history to form a true past timeline. Before this, he had already occupied the position of the origin of the immortal Wind Monastery in history through weaving an identity. However, this period of time was only 100 years before he transmigrated. Now, not only did Kui Heng have to occupy an even more ancient time point, but he also had to make preparations for the 300 years he was in the beginner's space and the 100 years before that. Therefore, how the identity of the origin of the immortal Wind Monastery was connected to his current identity, and how to trace back to an even more ancient identity, were all matters that had to be carefully considered. Kui Heng already had a plan for the former. He would let his identity as the source of the immortal Wind Monastery fall into a spatial vortex and descend to 10 years before he transmigrated. After a while, he would fall out of the spatial vortex and return to Daoju Star. However, he would lose his cultivation and need to cultivate again. The time when he came out of the spacetime vortex was the time when his main body entered the beginner's space to complete the continuation and connection of the timeline. As his main body was in the beginner's space, this could not be changed, and the timeline in the beginner's space could not be reversed. Therefore, the Kui Heng, who occupied this timeline, will become the main body's fake self. When his main body came out of the beginner's space 300 years later, he would fuse with the fake self. This way, he could go around the uniqueness of the beginner's space and completely occupy this period of time. It was not difficult to do it. As the timeline was relatively calm during that period of time, the level of information that Kui Heng would come into contact with wouldn't be high. There were no special experts, so there were naturally no obstacles. He could successfully occupy the timeline. However, starting from this time 10,452 years ago to connect to an even older past was a problem. This time was actually when Dao Hengzi was born. Beyond that, It should be Dao Heng's previous life. He had to choose his identity in the previous life well. He could not be too ordinary. This way, he would not be able to form a clear identity with the Dao mark, and it would be difficult to trace back to that time. He could not be too ostentatious. That might cause changes to the existing history, adding many variables, and it would also increase the difficulty of going back in time. After thinking about it, Kui Heng decided on an expert who had left a deep mark in history and done world-shaking things. However, he had also suffered great damage and could only reincarnate helplessly in the end. In order not to repeat his past identity's history, he decided to let this identity have an extremely long lifespan. As long as he lived long enough, the identity Dao mark could last for endless years. With such an identity and having done some earth-shattering things, he must have a long lifespan, an extraordinary identity, profound cultivation, and powerful strength. 754-3 Critical Time Points, 2. 754-3 Critical Time Points, 2. However, it was best not to cause a huge change in the original history, lest it cause some unknown changes to the current timeline. In this way, the more suitable way was to participate in the major changes in the original history or replace a certain person's position at that time point. According to the scale of the primordial world and the boundless chaos sea, what can be called a major change should be the 19 great chaos calamities. Kui Heng quickly had an idea. Then, he thought, however, at least 3 of the 19 chaos calamities have clearly changed the situation of the primordial world and the chaos sea. It was also the time when something happened to the immortal ancestors. The 4th and 11th chaos calamities, respectively, resulted in the deaths of the immortal ancestors. There was also an immortal ancestor who was injured by the Dao during the 16th chaos calamity and disappeared. In Kui Heng's plan, if he could interfere at these 3 time points, he should be able to weave a clear past identity and occupy this ancient timeline. Other than these 3 chaos calamities, the eruption of the first chaos calamity should also be a relatively critical time. It's quite important. Kui Heng thought to himself, after occupying the timeline formed by these 3 points, I can continue forward to the first eruption of the chaos calamity. I'll start from those 3 time points first. The closest one is the 16th chaos calamity. After that, an immortal ancestor disappeared. There's a record of this information in the Supreme God of Man's Remnant Inheritance. At that time, immortal ancestor Kong Yu fought against 3 other heaven-earth saints who joined forces against him and was injured by the power of the origin of the Supreme Gods of Heaven and Earth. Immortal ancestor Kong Yu used all her strength and even used the light left behind by the Supreme God of Man to barely escape. After escaping, she disappeared without a trace. No one knows where she went. Wait, this is... At this moment, Kui Heng suddenly felt something. A certain period of time in the past had suddenly changed slightly, and then it caused a series of changes to the current timeline. Immortal ancestor Kong Yu was no longer injured and had disappeared. Instead, she had not been affected by the power of the Supreme Gods of Heaven and Earth from the beginning, nor did she escape. In the original history, the 16th Great Chaos Calamity was the last time she appeared. Now, it was different. Every time the Chaos Calamity happened, she would appear. The past history of immortal ancestor Kong Yu has been modified. When was that? Kui Heng frowned. In his perception, scenes of the past flowed past like river water, quickly spinning in his mind, trying to find clues. With Kui Heng's current cultivation, he quickly found some clues in the past. Back then, after the immortal ancestors failed to chase after the ball of light left behind by immortal ancestor Zhongmu, the reason why they left so readily and did not continue to pester him was because they wanted to take advantage of that opportunity to make minor adjustments to immortal ancestor Kong Yu's past timeline. In the original timeline, immortal ancestor Kong Yu was being besieged by 3 Heaven-Earth saints. When the 3 Heaven-Earth saints were about to use the power left behind by the 2 Supreme Gods of Heaven and Earth, suddenly, a ball of light that contained the power left behind by the Supreme God of Man descended from the sky and enveloped immortal ancestor Kong Yu, sucking her away to prevent her from being injured by the power left behind by the Supreme Gods of Heaven and Earth. In this way, immortal ancestor Kong Yu's status returned to normal. In that case, the primordial world's side would still have 6 immortal ancestors at the current time point. They could barely make up for the loss of immortal ancestor Zhongmu. Moreover, because the timeline of immortal ancestor Zhongmu's death only happened slightly over 10,000 years ago, the primordial world had an additional immortal ancestor and 7 immortal ancestors in the recent chaos calamities. Although this did not change the overall situation of the current node much, it also allowed the primordial world to produce some advantages in the past few chaos calamities. After a few rounds of entanglement, they almost saved the immortal ancestor who had died in the 11th chaos calamity. This series of changes also replaced the memories in the minds of countless living beings in the primordial world and the Chaos Sea. There were no more memories of immortal ancestor Kong Yu escaping and disappearing. Instead, this immortal ancestor had always been in a good state. At this moment, be it the experts at the peak of the Chaos Sea's Taisu realm or the immortal emperors who had perfected the heavenless realm in the primordial world, their expressions were sorrowful, and their eyes could not help but flash with helplessness. In front of immortal ancestor-level experts, the past history, the lives of countless people in the past, and even their fates were like illusions that could be changed at any time. This made the many perfected immortal emperors who could sense similar changes in time almost despair. They felt too powerless. To those living beings below the perfected immortal emperor realm, there were no changes. This was because everything had always been like this and had never changed. At the time of the 16th Chaos Calamity, under the chaotic battle between the group of Heaven-Earth Saints and the 7 immortal ancestors, the entire primordial world was torn into pieces, and most of the immeasurable universe in the Chaos Sea was destroyed. Countless living beings were destroyed in body and soul in such a battle. At this moment, after immortal ancestor Shu Cheng used all his strength to activate the supreme god of man divine legacy in his body and saved immortal ancestor Kong Yu from being besieged, he changed the outcome of the chaos calamity. Such a change naturally could not be hidden from the many heaven-earth saints at this time. Hence, the river of time that had just calmed down was stirred up with waves again. The consciousness of a group of heaven-earth saints descended to that time point and counterattacked the 7 immortal ancestors. They focused on attacking immortal ancestor Kong Yu, wanting the timeline to return to its original trajectory. However, the 7 immortal ancestors were already prepared. They immediately activated the divine power of the supreme god of man and maximized the power of the primordial world, trying to expel the group of heaven-earth saints from the primordial world. To the immortal ancestors, they had already achieved their goal. As long as they expelled the group of heaven-earth saints from the primordial world and ended the chaos calamity, they could protect the results of their trip and keep immortal ancestor Kong Yu in her normal state. However, at this moment, Kui Heng suddenly descended. The vast dharmic powers unique to late-stage return to void cultivators surged majestically, directly covering the primordial world and the chaos sea of that time point. Since you've tampered with this time point, one immortal ancestor needs to die in this time point. Kui Heng's gaze locked onto immortal ancestor Zhong Yu and immortal ancestor Kong Yu. How audacious! Immortal ancestor Kong Yu was furious when she heard this. She immediately wanted to attack. She had never fought Kui Heng head-on, and she lacked an adequate understanding of Kui Heng's strength. Don't fight him. Immortal ancestor Shu Cheng understood Kui Heng's strength very well. He immediately stopped immortal ancestor Kong Yu and said to everyone, "It won't be too late to fight him after we recover. Let's go." The other immortal ancestors who had fought Kui Heng before also fled. They all felt that Kui Heng, who had descended at this time, seemed to have become even stronger. Did he improve at the present time point after receiving the legacy left behind by the supreme god of man? Facing such an enemy, they could not fight against him. Leaving was the best plan. However, just as the 7 immortal ancestors moved, 7 golden ropes flew over from ahead, and an incomparably terrifying imprisonment power surged over. Immortal binding rope. (755) History of Time, Dreams, and Illusions. 755 History of Time, Dreams, and Illusions. The balls of light left behind by the supreme god of man contained a large number of the origin mysteries of this world. Although Kui Heng had yet to completely comprehend them, he had already comprehended most of it. His cultivation realm had naturally increased, and he was much stronger than when he killed immortal ancestor Zhongmu. Therefore, the power of the immortal binding rope had also increased. Facing such a powerful imprisonment force, the 7 immortal ancestors did not even have the chance to dodge. They directly lost the ability to move and were frozen on the spot. Then, the 7 golden ropes landed on the 7 immortal ancestors and instantly bound them together. While the immortal binding rope imprisoned their movements, it also imprisoned all their strength. Even time was bound, causing the flow of time to stop for this moment. Even immortal ancestor-level experts could not break free from the shackles of the immortal binding rope in a short period of time. They could only look at Kui Heng, who had suddenly descended to this time point, in extreme shock. This was not the first time they had seen Kui Heng. When immortal ancestor Zhongmu died, they had even fought Kui Heng once and experienced the power of the immortal binding rope. However, at that time, the immortal binding rope was far less terrifying than now. Could he have fused with the power left behind by the supreme god of man? How did he become so much stronger all of a sudden? What exactly happened to his body? Immortal ancestor Shu Cheng was shocked. The other 4 immortal ancestors who had fought Kui Heng before had similar emotions. They could not understand why Kui Heng had suddenly become so powerful. The group of heaven-earth saints who had returned to this time point from the present time were also incomparably shocked. They could also feel the imprisonment power contained in the immortal binding rope. Just by investigating it, they already felt their scalps tingle. Such a powerful imprisonment power was simply unheard of and unbelievable. It was too powerful. Dao brother, you have great divine powers. Yuan Ming could not help but praise. He was the heaven-earth saint who had sent Kui Heng a visitation card and was preparing to come to the Puoyang Palace to visit Kui Heng. He had also come to this time point to try to stop immortal ancestor Kongyu from returning to her normal state. Yuan Ming did not expect Kui Heng to suddenly descend to this time point and even rely on his own strength to imprison the 7 immortal ancestors. After all, when immortal ancestor Zhongmu died, Kui Heng's strength was far from being so terrifying. Looking at the time now, how long has it been? He was already so powerful. Could this be the improvement brought about by the light orbs left behind by the supreme god of man? However, there was no aura of divine gift on his body. It was still an incomparably powerful but unfamiliar magical power. This made Kui Heng's image in Yuan Ming's heart look even more majestic and powerful. Kui Heng, we have no enmity with you. Why are you targeting us like this? Shu Chengxian roared angrily. From the characteristics of your strength, you're not walking the path of the Chaos Sea. There's no need to be our enemy at all. I'm not going against you. Kui Heng's gaze was calm as he said indifferently, this is just a road I have to take on my cultivation path. I've never deliberately targeted you. As he spoke, he raised his palm and circulated his dharmic powers to press down on immortal ancestor Kongyu, wanting to knock her down to the ground and return her to a state of being severely injured and on the verge of death. She who was supposed to be plagued by her Dao injuries would then disappear without a trace. Now that immortal ancestor Kongyu had been completely imprisoned by Kui Heng, under the power of the immortal binding rope, she could not even use a single bit of strength and could only be at the mercy of others. Under such circumstances, when Kui Heng slapped down, endless great Dao laws immediately deepened, continuously obliterating her vitality and soul. Even the divine inheritance of the supreme god of man fused into her body was greatly affected and was forcefully sealed in her body, preventing her from erupting with power to counterattack immediately. Previously, Kui Heng could not do this. Now that he already knew a lot about the nature of the divine power of the supreme god of man, he could naturally achieve a certain level of restriction. Under such layers of restrictions and shackles, immortal ancestor Kongyu was immediately beaten back to her original time point and fell into the siege of a group of heaven-earth saints. Just as the immortal ancestors at that time point was about to send down the divine power to save immortal ancestor Kongyu from the siege, a slender and white palm suddenly appeared, blocking the rescue of immortal ancestor Kongyu from afar. This directly caused immortal ancestor Kongyu to be surrounded and could not escape at all. At the same time, the three heaven-earth saints who besieged immortal ancestor Kongyu also activated the divine power of the supreme gods of heaven and earth in their bodies. An incomparably powerful great Tao power enveloped immortal ancestor Kongyu. The indelible Tao injuries on her body caused her body to suffer endless torture and suppression. "Isn't this called targeting?" Immortal ancestor Kongyu shouted angrily. Then, she used all his strength to break through the spatial rift and disappeared. She had hidden herself in the spatial turbulence. That was a chaotic place that confused the past, present, and future. It was like a vortex swimming in the river of time. As long as one entered, they would not be able to come out on their own. They could only wait for an extremely faint opportunity to be randomly thrown out of the spatial turbulence, but the timing of such a thing was uncertain. It could be in the endless past or the endless future. It was almost equivalent to a trip of no return. However, there was also an advantage in the spatial turbulence, which was that it could wear down her Tao injuries. The chaotic flow of time could strip away the power of the Tao injury to prevent her foundations from being damaged, or it could slowly make the Tao injury disappear. This was the only place that could heal the Tao injuries caused by the three supreme gods. The moment immortal ancestor Kongyu escaped into the spatial turbulence, Kuiheng also released the shackles on immortal ancestor Shu Yi and the other 6 immortal ancestors so that they could move freely. Then, he left this time point. Faced with such a situation, be it the 6 immortal ancestors or the group of heaven-earth saints, they could only withdraw their consciousness from this time point and return to the present. It was as if nothing had happened. However, in reality, from the moment immortal ancestor Kongyu was forced to enter the spatial turbulence by Kuiheng, the timeline was changed again. (756) History of Time, Dreams, and Illusions, 2. 756 History of Time, Dreams, and Illusions, 2. In the memories of countless living beings, immortal ancestor Kongyu had returned to her missing state and had never been saved. However, unlike the original timeline, experts like immortal ancestor Shu Yi had tried to save immortal ancestor Kongyu, but they were stopped by a mysterious expert. This caused the immortal ancestors to fail to save immortal ancestor Kongyu. At the same time, it aggravated immortal ancestor Kongyu's Tao injuries, forcing her to escape into the spatial turbulence to treat her injuries. Now that the chaos calamity was about to arrive, the mysterious existence that had once stopped several immortal ancestors with his shocking strength had appeared again. These rumors would also spread with the new memories. The perfected immortal emperors sighed again. What exactly was history? To the immortal ancestors, history was simply a toy that they could play with as they pleased. At the present time point, inside the Pure Yang Palace, Kuiheng slowly opened his eyes and comprehended the changes on him. Then, a faint smile appeared on his face. This method is indeed feasible. Thanks to the huge impact caused by the 16th Chaos Calamity, both the Heaven-Earth Saint Realm experts and the immortal ancestors had a deep impression of him. His deeds were also left in the memories of countless living beings, and he became a real figure in history. This allowed the spatial Tao mark he had formed during the 16th Chaos Calamity to become real. Next, I'll use this Tao mark to further backtrack to the time periods where I was not around and connect it into a line before occupying it. Kuiheng made up his mind and immediately began to take action. After stepping into the river of time, he started from 10,452 years before the current time point and went back in time. Time flowed forward without stopping, while Kuiheng was moving against the current. This process was extremely fast. After breaking through to the late-stage return to Void Realm and obtaining the Great Tao Light Balls, Kuiheng already possessed an extremely high essence of life. His existence had already begun to naturally spread to the past. Therefore, to the current Kuiheng, as long as he materialized a spatial Tao mark in the past, he could quickly weave a timeline and occupy that time period. Hence, the mysterious expert Kuiheng, who suddenly appeared in the 16th Chaos Calamity, began to live permanently in the world. However, this expert did not have a fixed affiliation. Sometimes, he was in the Chaos Heaven, sometimes in the ninth heaven. There was also no fixed image of him. Sometimes, he was a high and mighty immortal god, and sometimes, he was an ordinary merchant. It was as if he had jumped out of the myriad worlds and was no longer a living being. He could do whatever he wanted. He also never had any disputes with others, but no one doubted his status. This mysterious expert's performance in the 16th Chaos Calamity had established his status, and it was unshakable. Whether it was in the primordial world or the boundless Chaos Sea, he was respected. Following such a timeline, Kui Heng completed the fabrication and continuance of his past history. Step by step, he moved from the time point of 10,000 years ago to the 19th Chaos Calamity. There, he took part in the layers of disputes and left the mark of his presence in history. Then, using the same method, he spread his influence into the 18th and 17th Chaos Calamity. In the end, he connected his presence with the mysterious expert who appeared in the 16th Chaos Calamity and completed the unification of the timeline. At this point, Kui Heng had already gone back 56 primeval eras, which was 36 billion years ago. He had truly become an extremely ancient existence. At the same time, his fake selves occupied the various universes on the timeline. Whether it was in the boundless Chaos Sea or in the primordial world, there were traces of his existence. Legends about him were spread in many civilizations. In the understanding of most living beings, Kui Heng was an ancient expert who had existed for more than 300 billion years. Now, he had only reappeared in the world and established a fixed dojo in a universe in the boundless Chaos Sea. Only experts at the perfected Immortal Emperor and Immortal Ancestor realm knew that Kui Heng was actually not an ancient expert. Instead, he had returned to the past from this time and occupied the ancient timeline. But this was actually meaningless. After Kui Heng occupied the past timeline, he had already become a real ancient existence. Moreover, it was because he was powerful enough to leave behind extremely deep and real Tao marks in 4 chaos calamities that he could become so ancient. Such an ancient foundation was the most stable. However, occupying the timeline of the 16th Chaos Calamity was not the end. The gift left behind by the Supreme God of Man also had more than this effect. Kui Heng still had to continue going back to an even older timeline. He had to become more ancient and closer to the original state of this world. Only then could he approach the origin mysteries of this world and become all-knowing, reaching the prerequisite of the Tao integration realm. Next is the 11th Chaos Calamity. Kui Heng thought to himself, this time, an immortal ancestor died in the Chaos Calamity. The ball of light left behind by the Supreme God of Man also dissipated on the spot. This event can be used as an opportunity to establish a spatial Tao mark. While Kui Heng was calculating his next plan, the remaining 5 immortal ancestors had already arrived at the peak of the 9th heaven to discuss. This was once a holy cultivation ground for the Supreme God of Man. Later on, the 9 immortal ancestors proclaimed themselves as immortals and used this as the foundation to open up 9 worlds. They were raised high in the sky and differentiated from the living beings on the ground to show their high and mighty status. Therefore, the essence of the top level of the 9 heavens was extremely high. It could completely isolate the outside world and effectively prevent outsiders from prying in. The 5 immortal ancestors were led by Immortal Ancestor Shu Cheng. The other 4 were Immortal Ancestor Yuling, Immortal Ancestor Luo Qian, Immortal Ancestor Hanming, and Immortal Ancestor Huang Yun. These 5 immortal ancestors were existences that suppressed the entire primordial world and even the boundless Chaos Sea in the past countless years. At this moment, they were a little uneasy. Kui Heng, who had appeared out of thin air, was completely beyond their understanding. No matter what, they could not understand why such a situation happened. An existence that had not grasped the power of the 3 supreme gods could actually possess power equivalent to or stronger than the immortal ancestors. It was simply unbelievable. Moreover, this person was clearly closer to the boundless Chaos Sea. In that case, the primordial world would be in danger. The change in the 16th Chaos Calamity is probably not his final goal. At this moment, Immortal Ancestor Shu Cheng suddenly said, Kui Heng is actually not ancient. His path to becoming stronger is to first weave his identity at a key historical node before forcefully rewinding time and occupying the entire timeline leading up to that historical node. His target next is probably the 11th and 4th Chaos Calamities. He will definitely participate in them and create an important identity as the coordinates to backtrack in time. If we continue to let him go forward like this, we will no longer have any secrets. The great secret of the three supreme gods will be known by a 10th person. We can't let such a thing happen. Then what should we do? Immortal ancestor Yuling asked in a low voice. From the looks of it, we're no longer that fellow's match. We can barely protect ourselves. Have you forgotten how we helped the supreme god of man expel the supreme gods of heaven and earth back then? Immortal ancestor Shu Cheng's eyes narrowed slightly. Power is not the only thing that the supreme god of man left behind for us. It's enough for us to restrain Kui Heng. If we handle it well, we might even be able to kill him. You're tuning in to the Celestial War YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.